we've started recording.
Okay.
So this is pretty cool. This is pretty exciting for me. This is my first podcast episode ever of our Straight Shooter podcast. So I'm really looking forward to this. I have Bill Greene.
Bill Greene, that's
Bill
fine.
Greene. All right, great. And you are a political science professor?
I am. I'm assistant professor of political science at South Texas College and assistant chair of the political science department.
Yeah, I bet it's an interesting time to be a political science professor right now.
That's an understatement. Yes, it's, every day there's something new, obviously. So it's interesting because like if I'm teaching like American government, we'll be on a certain topic, but it's so hard to stay on that particular topic because something's happened in the news that day or something, and the students are like, "Hey, what about this?" And so then then you have to find ways to somehow relate what you are talking about to what maybe you haven't talked about yet, but you're going to in the future. It is a really interesting time.
It's an interesting time. Do you ever worry when you're teaching political science and say, oh, maybe this is going to be one of those days where there's that argument that starts up in class?
I don't because I found that the students are all over the place. Mm-hmm. So some of them, they're just not that interested in politics and government and things like that. It's not their thing. They have to be at class. So they're not that interested in arguing about anything. But others, the ones that pay a little bit more attention, I think they have more questions than they do.
Sure.
A lot of them haven't really solidified into their own belief systems yet. Mm-hmm. And so, they're sort of drifting along, and now all of a sudden they're learning about these different things, and so this is what's helping them to, studies have shown that it's that 18 to 25 age range where you start to solidify your ideology, your thoughts on what should government do, what should government not do in different areas. And so I sort of see that as my job in terms of presenting to them, look, here's all your options. Here's all the things. Here are all the great thinkers. Here's all the policies that are out there. Here's all the different argumentations on all sides of these different issues. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. And you can start to develop your own thoughts, your own belief system, your own ideology. And again, a lot of them just haven't thought about it before. Yeah, very much anyway. And so something could happen during the day, or something that week has happened, and students will bring it up and discuss. The only time I've really seen any real debates or even arguments is if it's like right when it's the hot time of an election, especially presidential. Then you see some debates.
Yeah, I imagine we always say, as someone who's in news, we always say we live in a 24-hour news cycle, but I feel like it's more 24-second news cycle.
That's sort of the way it is now.
We just kind of every 5 seconds it feels like there's something new. I mean, you look at the headlines on any national news outlet, and it always says news alert, breaking news, developing story. Sure. There's always something happening. So is it hard to keep up?
It's hard to keep up in the particulars. I think for the major issues, for the broad themes and everything, you can always find stuff within the broad themes and bring that into the classroom. But I mean, I have to not only keep up with what's in current events, so I can related in the classroom, but I have to keep up with what's the latest scholarship in these different particular areas, and so because that way I can bring the scholarship into the classroom as well, and we can link them together. Because one thing I tell my students every time is, look, your textbook says that this is how it's done. Yeah. But let me tell you how it actually works.
Because there's a real way this happens.
There's the textbook and there's the real world, and sometimes they coincide, but a lot of times,
it's like the difference between being book smart and street smart. There's a vast difference.
Yeah. So you really have to bring sort of the real world, how politics actually works, and luckily I have background there as well,
Sure.
So I can bring that into the classroom, and it's not just ivory tower academia.
Well, I imagine it's a good responsibility for you because, like you said, you're the first introduction to a lot of young kids into the world of politics. Maybe he'll start learning about it a little bit in high school, but they don't really go too much in depth until they hit the college years.
It really is true, and one of the things I've found is, and this isn't just here in the Valley. I have found this because I've been here about 6 years, but the other states where I've taught, and other professors and so forth that I've taught to in other states, it's a common issue that the high schools just aren't teaching civics very much anymore.
Right. They're not.
They're not teaching government. They're not teaching the Constitution, especially. And so when they get to me, my expectation is that they don't know anything.
Okay.
And if they do know stuff, then I'm like, hey, you're ahead of the game here. But we're going to start at that baseline of you just don't know much of anything. I always have at least one student every semester that doesn't even know we have a Constitution. So,
no, really?
Oh yeah, because it's just not something they thought about or that they paid attention to if they were taught. And so then they're like, okay, well, what's that? What does it do? Okay, let's get into that. And I think that's just a lot of fun. When they're coming in sort of as a blank slate, and you could say, all right, here's how we were founded. Here's what it was supposed to work like. And now let's talk about how has that changed over the years. How does it actually work nowadays compared to how it was supposed to work? And they actually can see the bigger picture. And it's kind of exciting.
You're really starting from the basics with a lot of these kids. And one thing I wonder with you and a lot of college professors is you see all the time on TV now about the atmosphere, how it changes on college campuses. Maybe it's not happening on your college, but is it something you ever take notice of where students are maybe protesting more or they're being more active politically?
Yeah, I think so. You don't see it as much at a school like South Texas College, where I'm at. One of the things is we're very large. I mean, we've got 30-something thousand students, but we're spread out over 5 campuses, and so there's there is the large main campus in McAllen, but again, there's not a lot of centralization, so the students don't have central places, but they do have, like at our campus, we have a political science club, and they can do a lot of things. They can get active. We have other student organizations. But one of the things that's different also is we're not a residential college, so we don't have dorms. They're not staying there all the time. These are students. They go off. They have lives. They're working. They've got families and things like that. So it's harder to get them to become more active in, say, politics or government or something like that. But again, that's one of my jobs too, is to at least get them. I mean, we have requirements where you have to have some sort of political activism, as, say, in a Texas government class.
Okay.
So, but that can be registered to vote, and half my students haven't ever registered to vote.
Right.
So we get them registered to vote, and then if it's election time, let's encourage them to get out there. But I've also had other students that, because even though they had never really gotten involved much in politics before, when they started taking the classes, the political science classes, they did get more interested, and they said, wow, this is more interesting than I thought it was, and they started getting involved. I've had students that then, like in the 2016 campaign, I had one particular student who had never been involved in politics but got so interested. He said, how can I get more involved? I said, well, pick your political party that you like more, and go to their precinct and county convention and get involved there, see what it's like. And if you like that, become a delegate to the state convention. If you think that's a lot of fun, try to get to go to the national convention. You're young, you can do this. And he did, and he went all the way to the state convention, and was just a few votes short of going to the national convention.
Wow!
As a 18-year-old delegate, going up there. So
holding the sign and everything.
Yeah. And I walked him through the processes of doing things, because I've done that plenty of times. And so he really enjoyed it. And after that, he ended up, I think he's going to law school now. And I mean,
wow.
So you see students that can catch on to these things. But then I know there's a lot of students that, again, it's just not their thing. But I want them to have at least that basic understanding. This is how your government works. This is what because if they don't know that, then when the government does something they're not supposed to do, well, how will they know? They don't know what the rules are, so how do they know that the government violated those rules? So I want to make sure they understand government has its own boundaries that it's supposed to stay within.
We always talk about how divisive times tend to be right now, or seem to be. I would imagine there's a lot of bittersweet feeling with you in politics, where, especially when it comes to your students, because on one side, when times get so volatile like they are, students, I would imagine, either say, I want to become a delegate, I want to become a warrior for my party, I want to really try hard to help them succeed. But on the other end, people say, I'm shutting myself off from politics forever. If this is what it is, I don't want any part of it.
Yeah, and it's hard to blame them for that. I feel that way a lot of times myself, where, where I say, this is
why did I pick this career?
People have lost their minds. It blows me away, and it's not even as much a partisan thing, because I mean I could sit there and say, these people in this political party or on this side of the ideological spectrum, they've lost their freaking minds. They've completely gone off the deep end.
Yeah.
But then I could turn around and see what's happening on the other side, and I'm like, they've lost their freaking minds. But then I think about, the good thing is, from my perspective, I have a historical perspective too. Mm-hmm. And the kinds of really nasty conflicts that we've seen in politics in recent years are actually not new. I mean, these are sort of things that have been happening since the beginning of our country. I mean, if you look at like Jefferson and Madison, I mean, those two who had been good friends, they end up in different political parties, and just when they ran against each other for president, man, they were nasty to each other and called their mother's name.
Yes.
And, all sorts of things. So, and I try to explain that to the students too, because they're like, gosh, isn't this different than it used to be? Sometimes, but it's still, this will survive.
Yeah.
This is America, and we get through these things.
Yeah, it seems like it was actually only recently that politics became the civil man's game, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't know where that came from.
Like all of a sudden we just decided, politicians need to be more civil, they need to be more straight-laced, but then you go back 100 years, 150 years and beyond, mm-hmm. and like you said, it was vastly different.
True. I wish it was that it was just civil and it wasn't, war by other means. Mm-hmm. Because what you want to have is, let's say you have a political campaign, an election campaign going on. What mm-hmm. you want to have is just a good discussion of the issues. And, okay, this candidate says, here's where I stand on this issue. I think government ought to do this. And this candidate says, well, I disagree. I think government ought to do this. And here's where I stand. And you want it to be that way, mm-hmm. So that then voters can make this intelligent choice based on the issues and where people stand. But the candidates just play to the voters, and the voters most of them really aren't looking for this civil debate of, well, I stand here and I stand here. Most voters they've picked sides, and they're already very partisan. It's already deeply divided, and what they want to hear is, my
what
side
good
hear. And your side bad, and
it's
my
like
team go rah rah rah.
It's like I always compare it to when you're in a relationship and the woman asks, do you want me to wear the blue dress or the red dress? And the husband says the red dress, but she really just wants you to agree with her in your voice, that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly.
And I feel like that's what a lot of politics has become, mm-hmm. is it's people only wanting to hear their side of it because they want to reaffirm their beliefs.
Yeah, there's a lot of confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias,
what you can often call echo chambers.
And
I think social media has sort of exacerbated that. If you go onto Facebook or, God forbid, Twitter, all you're going to see is these bubbles that people live within, and when they hear some other point of view, people go nuts nowadays. It's gotten to the point where I stay pretty active on social media, and what I've had to start doing just in recent years is, if somebody's just going to be a troll, they got to go.
Yeah.
I don't have time for that. And there's a lot of people that they just like to hear themselves talk, but they really do. You can see on someone's Facebook page, they post some political opinion.
Sure.
And everybody chimes in. Yeah, that's right. And they, and one person speaks up and says, well, I don't agree with that. It's just this huge this dog pile on that person, because, you have to think the right way. You got to think just like us. And I'm not talking it's just liberals or it's just conservatives that do that. It's them, it's libertarians, it's everybody has their
we all have our bubbles that we like to live in.
Exactly. Yeah. Because we're comfortable. It's just human.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to be I wonder if a lot of the divisiveness comes from how easy our lives have become. If that makes any sense,
like a first world problem.
A first world problem. I mean, we're not hunting for our food, really. We're not having to fight for shelter.
Right.
We're not conquering lands, so we have to find issues that we need that competition in our lives, and we have to find those issues somehow.
Well, that could be part of it. Certainly, if you look at some of the literature in political psychology, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think a lot of people now are a lot of people that haven't gotten involved in politics in the past Now they've gotten involved because they got passionate about some issue or couple of issues. And that's really all they knew about. And now they've gotten more involved, and they got involved in voting, and now I'm going to support a candidate. And if you don't expand beyond that with more issues, more knowledge, more information, then you are going to be trapped in a little bubble. And again, bringing that back, I think that's one of my roles as an educator is, look, here's lots of information. And
sure.
And sometimes it's a fire hose that I'm shooting their way.
Yeah.
But all that information is important for them as they go on in life. So I try to explain to them, yes, I know you're not here because most of you aren't here because you're political science majors or you love talking about government and politics. You're here because this is a required core course in the curriculum. But that's okay because you're going to get some basics. By the time you come out of here, you're
get something out of it
in life.
Yeah.
And most of my students come back and say, yeah, I never cared about any of this stuff before, and now I find it interesting. So that's good.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, you're absolutely right about the confirmation bias that we like to live in. One thing I love to do is I'll watch Fox News, and then I'll change the channel to CNN, and then I'll change the channel to MSNBC. And
right,
I love seeing how they present different stories
sure.
of the same story in different ways.
Right.
And it's so odd to me, but I think, like you said, people have to get out of their comfort levels and realize that there's another way to look at every story.
Sure.
And I think that's a serious problem with
and I try to
media
emphasize
a
to
lot.
the students that these are just human beings.
Yeah.
There's no thing called government. That's a mental construct. That's a thing in your mind. It's that people have agreed to come together on something. Ultimately, I mean, you can't touch government. You can't, there's not a thing there. So government is just people. And so since it's just people, that means that it's affected by this little thing I like to call human beings. And being a human being means that you've got a lot of, you're a political animal. Aristotle, I believe it was, that said, we're political animals.
Yeah.
And maybe it was Socrates. Anyway, we're political animals in that way that we do want to congregate, we do want to come together and find those common grounds. But we also want to look for who doesn't agree with us.
Exactly.
And who's the other.
We like to fight the people who aren't on our side.
I think that's why sports gets so popular.
Oh, absolutely.
Politics is my sports. And so I had my kids, my poor kids, when they were growing up, people would ask them, oh, what sports are y'all into, in your family? And my son especially, he started telling people, well, we don't really get into sports very much. Like we don't watch ESPN. We watch CSPN. My dad. So, but that's because it really is. It's kind of like sports. And,
yeah.
Oh, well, we got the playoffs. What do you mean the playoffs? Oh, that's the primaries.
Yeah, and that's tough. Is I think people treat it like a game, and the reality is, of course, it is a lot of a matchup. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? But because politics falls on such a spectrum, it's hard to want to compare it to a game where there's one side and there's the Astros and then there's the Yankees. Right. And it's hard to just pick a side because you were talking philosopher. Socrates was always big on human independence.
Right.
And I always respected that because, you could be half of one way, half the other, and just not really want to take anybody's side because in some point they're going to disagree with you.
Right.
And I don't know how healthy that is, that every time there's an issue that breaks out, every time that there's whatever it is, whether a shooting, some sort of attack, whether there's a scandal that breaks, everybody has to go to their battle stations.
Yeah, very quickly. And I think maybe more quickly than the past, only because of social media. Social media just sort of, I think, multiplies everything. It multiplies happiness, it multiplies rage, it multiplies sadness because everybody suddenly is chipping in ways that they never have before, in ways that they haven't come together to do so before. And so, I think that, and my students are the same way. It's just that my students, for the most part, are not as concerned about the things I would be concerned about. They're concerned about, I don't know, what's happening with the Kardashians or something like that. But even those kinds of things, we can relate them to politics nowadays.
I think Cardi B's the new one. I'm not a big Cardi B fan, but she's the one everybody follows, and Ariana Grande, I think, is the other one.
Right.
I don't know if the Kardashians have faded as much.
Who knows? Well, I'm too old to know these things.
I've been called the world's oldest millennial. I don't pay attention to this stuff either. But let's talk about what's going on right now. It's, I would imagine, hard to pull away. I have to pay attention to it so much, and I get addicted to it, I think.
And I keep thinking that everyone else already knows all this stuff too. You're all paying attention to this, aren't you?
Yeah.
And then they're like, what?
And then you ask somebody, oh, did you hear about that? No, what happened? Well, it's been all over the news every single day for the past 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. I'll constantly say to my students, well, I was watching C-SPAN the other day, and I'm sure you were watching it too, right?
Yeah.
Like, what?
C-SPAN. Yeah. So how often does your class divert from what your lesson plan is, say teaching them about the branches of government versus, hey, this happened today? Because like we said, it's happening all the time.
Pretty often.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the good thing is what I try when I teach it, especially let's say American government. When I'm teaching American government, I teach it mostly. I'm not just going, all right, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 in the textbook. I use they have to read the chapters and they take quizzes on chapters, but that's as a foundation for what then I'm going to be talking about in class. So a lot of times I'm just going right through the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And so we'll get to this clause in the Constitution and I'll say, and here's how this relates right now. And so if you're going through the different sections of the Constitution, and then you can pull things out and say, and here's what this relates to, here's how this is relevant to your life right now, then they start seeing, okay, there's a connection between this document with weird words in it that I don't understand, and what just happened yesterday. And so suddenly, and then the good thing is I know when they are paying more attention when they start asking the right questions. So
that's good.
So when the students start asking me things like, what is this thing about Donald Trump and an emergency declaration? Is that in the Constitution? What is going on there? That's a great question. Let's talk about that. Because remember when we were talking about this in the Constitution? Well, now let's look at that. And so you really can start relating it. And it does. It happens all the time. Even if something is not exactly what we've been, where we're at and talking about it, it all ties together so well that I can relate most things. And if it's something that's too far out, then I'll say it's a great question and we're going to get to it. Let me get back to you.
It's nice to be able to apply all the real world action in the lesson plans, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So let's get to talking about what we're seeing right now in the world of politics. 2020's right around the corner.
Oh, boy.
These things never end. I feel like 100% of the time people are campaigning. No matter what.
Yeah.
So
the moment they get elected and beyond.
The moment they get elected. So a lot of talk has been going around Beto O'Rourke. For those who are listening and don't know, we're actually in Harlingen, Texas right now. We're in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, which is the southern tip of all of Texas and pretty much all of the United States.
Yep.
So Beto O'Rourke is a popular name down here. Mm-hmm. What is your take on him? A lot of people are saying he's not going to win Texas if he would become the nominee, and how important is that to win your home state?
It's pretty important. You see things happen where there have been people like Al Gore. If Al Gore had won his home state of Tennessee, he'd have won the presidency, and he lost his home state of Tennessee.
Right.
So it can come down to those types of things, but especially with Texas, because Texas has the second largest number of electoral votes in the Electoral College. So if he could win Texas, that would be a huge boost for him. Mm-hmm. And running for president, that may be more of a possibility. I mean, when he ran against Cruz, he sure came closer than a lot of people have come on statewide. Democrats haven't won statewide since 94 in Texas, and so I think he did surprise a lot of people. But again, part of that was who he was running against, and Cruz has his own things his own negatives that he had to deal with. So in running for president, it used to be that I could say, well, here's what I think is going to happen. I have no idea anymore of the things that are going to happen. I mean, there's possibilities of things. So if Trump is most likely, if Trump is the Republican nominee again, if Beto were to get the Democratic nomination, then I think all bets would be off. I mean, he's got a lot of popularity just from who he presents himself as. And he presents himself as, sort of a Robert Kennedy-esque type.
I've heard him compared to him a lot.
A lot. And but also he seems to be more not as hyper left-wing liberal as maybe some other candidates, some other Democrats. He seems to be a little bit more moderate. But in this sort of hyper-partisan age, that doesn't matter as much anymore. If you're a Democrat, well, that means you must be a socialist. If you're a Republican, oh, you must be, some sort of racist. I mean, it's this hyperbole that we have now. So for Beto himself, he'd have to overcome that as well, because you're going to have, I mean, there's going to be the base that Trump has, no matter what, is Trump.
Sure.
But I think that right now within the Democratic Party, there is this fight over who the base of the party really is. And I think that's what he or anybody is going to encounter.
And I always wonder about that, because in 2016, they were saying the same thing about Republicans, where Trump was in the running and they said, it looks like there's going to be this real divide in the Republican Party. And now it looks like the same thing with Democrats. But I always wonder, because I think to myself, I say, no matter who the nominee is, everybody's in that party is going to get behind it, because they would. I don't think they would afford to just say, no, he's not what we represent. They're eventually going to have to say, okay, this is our guy.
For the most part, that is, and that's one of the problems that third parties have.
Right.
Is third party candidates could poll. I mean, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, he polled pretty high for a third party in the last election. But you have this, and this is pretty standard stuff, that by the time you get to the election itself, a lot of that support, the voters at the last minute basically say, yeah, maybe I'm throwing my vote away if I do that, so I'm going to vote for who I would normally vote for, party-wise. So that's a difficult thing to overcome, because that is a natural thing. People tend to, I don't like this guy, I don't like this guy, I don't like this guy, and it's election day, and he's in my party, and I'm going to vote for him.
Right.
Or her. And so I think you're absolutely right on that, is that people then, they get the my team, rah, rah, rah kind of mentality again, and just do it.
Well, you mentioned, speaking of third parties, we heard a lot about him when he first announced, but I've kind of been curious about what would happen with Howard Schultz and how that would impact the 2020 election. A lot of Democrats are saying, just stop right now because you could ruin it.
Yeah.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
And I wonder what would happen with him.
Personally, I'm in favor of as many parties as possible having candidates on any ballot. I think it's great to have a lot of choice, a lot of variety, but obviously people in the major parties, that's certainly not how they're going to feel.
Sure.
But studies have shown that third parties, like people say, oh, well, if it wasn't for Ross Perot, then George H.W. Bush could have won re-election. But studies that were done afterwards show that no, that's not actually true. Clinton still probably would have beat him, and the same thing with the 2000 election in Florida. And if Ralph Nader hadn't won it, well, it turns out that maybe that's not exactly true. And so I think having third parties is a good thing to have on there. Someone like Schultz, though. Yes, what you see happening is during the primary season is when people will really go after anyone that wants to deviate from the party, because we're focused on our party right now. And so that makes it hard for the third parties during primary season. So they don't get any real attention unless they're stepping out from their own party until you get to the general election. But then in the general election, of course, it's, the Libertarians just draw votes from Republicans. The Greens just draw votes from the Democrats. Oh, this independent, they're more conservative, so they're going to draw votes from Republicans. When I think a lot of studies show that, no, for the most part, third-party candidates don't as much draw voters from the other parties as they bring voters out who probably weren't going to vote otherwise. And so, don't get me wrong, there are people that can do that, say, well, maybe I would have voted for this other party candidate. But voting for a third party candidate that's a pretty far out thing to do in America. And so people that actually vote for third party candidates, it's not because they just did it on a lark, did it on a whim. These are people that actually think about their votes, probably more than a lot of people that vote
for the major parties. Yeah, I would imagine. And I think we always say we want multiple parties. We want all this political input from people of various political ideologies, rather. But I always wonder if there would have to be a tough transition period. I think if we went from Republican, Democrat to Libertarian a serious threat as well. The Green Party and whoever else wanted to throw their hat in the ring. There would have to be some sort of transition.
Yeah, no, I think, or there'd have to be some radical thing occur to some sort of a transformative event to occur where people would say, you know what, the heck with this party, I'm going over to that party. Kind of like the Whigs into the Republicans. And that could happen at any time, obviously, but the idea of a party gradually gaining more and more strength and more followers, the way that our system is set up, it is set up to benefit the two parties.
Sure.
And so for a third party to even get onto the ballot is such a hard thing for them to do. So I think it would have to be some sort of radical shift where all of a sudden a whole lot of Democrats said, the Democratic Party isn't doing it for me, and there's this third party over here, and I think I'm going to go with that instead. Or if a whole lot of Republicans suddenly said, oh, the Republican Party has to become the party of too much government, so I'm going to go for the Libertarians.
Right.
They're limited government. It's much more likely that the third parties the two major parties will do what they've done so long, which is co-opt whatever's really popular in the third parties,
right, and
absorb that into their own party so they can attract those people to vote for them as well.
Yeah, I always view politics as being, we always talk about politics being on a linear spectrum, but I always view it as being more circular than anything else.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to put it. The linear view, the left to right scale, I think is incredibly outdated and outmoded. One of the things that I like to use, and there's a paper that I'm co-authoring with a professor over at UT-RGV that we submitted that talks about this as well, and that is looking at ideology through a quadrant system, basically, instead of just the left to right, liberal to conservative. That if you take something like Feldman and Johnson, or maybe the Nolan chart, something like that, where you've not only got liberals and conservatives, but you've also got libertarians, because libertarians agree with liberals about half the time, and they agree with the conservatives about half the time. It just depends on, are you talking about personal issues? Are you talking about economic issues?
Right.
But then you've also got those that want much more government in both of those areas, more of the statists and people, socialists, social democrats, and so forth. And so I really like looking at the more of a quadrant-based approach, just because it includes much more of the ideologies, especially in America, the ideologies that are out there. Because most of the recent research, if you do more than just liberal and conservative, if you include, for example, libertarian, most of the recent research shows that it's pretty evenly divided in terms of between 22 and 25% liberal in America, 22 and 25% conservative, and around 22 to 25% libertarian. Just not self-identified. It's where do you stand on these policy positions, and then you can take where these people stand and place them on the chart, and you see, but most people, you say, hey, oh, it looks like you're a libertarian. They're like, what's that?
Yeah, they don't really know what that means. They need better PR, it sounds like.
And again, that's my job as a teacher. I'm going to teach you these ideologies.
No, I think libertarians might need a little bit better PR than they've been getting.
They have since about the 1970s.
At least more exposure, at the very least. But I think what a problem with it is just the fact that we call it libertarian, and a lot of people think it's too close to being called liberal.
Liberal, exactly.
So
which
originally
it was. It was what liberalism used to be until Franklin Roosevelt. So then liberalism became the modern liberalism that we know today. But it used to be what now we call classical liberalism.
Right.
And so yeah, I think a lot of people are that way. And maybe libertarians just need a new name. Who knows?
Yeah, and I think, as someone who's in the media, I think we get stuck on names like democratic socialism, and then on the other side we get stuck on names like alt-right, and I don't know what percentage, I wish I did, of the people who fell under those labels represented the parties, but I would imagine it's a very small number, and we always tend to draw ourselves to those two groups of people, whether it's alt-right or I'm a democratic socialist, I don't believe in borders, I don't believe in government, whatever it is.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people like labels.
Yes,
and because labels help us to understand the world. And I have a real problem with labels, but I have to live with labels because I teach this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's, if there's anybody that labels people, it's people in political science. But on the other hand, it's also helpful to students that don't really know much about what's happening politically or even historically. It helps them to get labels and to learn labels and to say, okay, liberals believe in more government intervention in economic issues, but less government intervention in personal issues. Mm-hmm. And conservatives are the opposite. Okay, I can remember that a little bit easier. So when they see somebody proposing a policy for government to get involved in in some economic activity to try to steer the economy some certain way or something, then they can look at that and say, oh, well, that's more of a liberal position to have because liberals want government to be involved in economics. And they get this idea. If they're pushing for government to be a lot less involved, to be more free market oriented, then they might say, oh, that's more of a conservative concept. Or they might say that's conservative and libertarian, mm-hmm. If they had me, maybe. So hopefully, I think one of the things that I've seen, and this is in the broader society, is there is a much higher interest in politics than there was in the past, mm-hmm. right now, at least in the immediate past. But I'm not sure that's the best thing right now. I've said for so many years, I wish more people were interested in politics. Yeah. And now I'm like, I wish less people were interested.
Be careful what you wish for. Yeah, I think a lot of people before 2016, and maybe it even started way before then, because I wasn't very politically active until I really started my career. But I would say, I think a lot of people lived in a sort of blissful ignorance about the world and the way it worked, and people were happy, people were peaceful, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. If you don't pay attention, that's fine. If you have your personal beliefs, mm-hmm. great, and you want to vote on them. But if you start becoming emotionally invested in something every turn of the corner, mm-hmm. that might start to be unhealthy.
And I think the question you have to ask is, well, what has made people become much more emotionally invested? Mm-hmm. And part of that is that government has gotten so active, mm-hmm. and so big and involved in every little detail of everybody's lives that now people are like, well, I guess I better pay attention to this stuff, because every time I turn around, government is making me do this or stopping me from doing that or insisting on this thing happening. And so I think that's caused people to pay attention more. I've been especially noticing young people a lot more getting involved. And it started, I think, when in the 2008 the presidential election, where you saw tons of young people coming in through the Ron Paul campaign, running for president on the Republican ticket. Ron Paul, of course, is a libertarian Republican,
right?
And in fact was a Libertarian Party member, ran for president back in the 90s, or 80s. But you saw a lot of young people coming into the party, and one of the things that you saw in response was a lot of the establishment party people were who are always like, we want more and more young people coming into the party, and they all came into the party, and then they were like, that's not what we meant. Because we didn't mean Ron Paul supporters. We didn't mean you young people. We meant people that would come in, sit down, and shut up and do it, and get the party going, and not be so into policies and issues. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing has happened in the 2016 election with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And you saw tons of young people coming into the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party establishment saying, that's not what we meant. That's not
right.
We said we want all these young people. We want young people that would come in and sit down and shut up and do what they were told. So I think what you've seen happen is in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, you have seen this influx of people that got really interested in politics because of certain political figures, and then a lot of them stayed, and a lot of them got really mad at the establishment of their own party, and as a result of that, they did one of either two things. Either they left because they were fed up with it, or they said, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to take action. And you saw a lot of the Ron Paul Republicans that now have come up through the ranks that did stay, and they're now in Congress, they're in state legislatures all over the country. Now the same thing with the Bernie supporters, where you've got, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez
right.
who came up and went to through Congress. You've got all these other Bernie supporters. I think what's going to be interesting to see is all these people that came into the Democratic Party through Bernie Sanders, are they going to stick with Bernie Sanders, or are they going to go to somebody else that's now going to be running for president? That's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and you say that we want people to get more involved in politics, but when they do, everything starts shattering because everybody has their, not in a bad way, but everybody has their own ideas. And then, like you said, everybody says, wait a second. No. We wanted you to be independent, but like our kind of independent. Right. We wanted you to have an independent thought, but just what we think. It's very odd. And I don't know why it is. I mean, it's obvious why it is, and where, the more thoughts there are, the more breakaway parties that can form, and whether it's a Tea Party or whether it's a democratic socialism, or there's a small party here, small party there, and you just kind of see which one gains traction, I guess.
Yeah, and I think ideology means more now than it did, say, 40 years ago. Both in the Democratic and Republican parties, you've got a lot more ideological. But then again, you've got some things where ideology maybe doesn't play the role that you would think it would play. I mean, Donald Trump becoming president, it wasn't because he was this huge, super conservative guy that rose to the top of the Republican Party.
He was probably a little more liberal than more recent conservative presidents.
There was a lot of conservatives that were. I mean, even Ted Cruz. He's not. Donald Trump's not a conservative,
right?
And in many ways, he's not. He's certainly much more conservative than I think most of the. But he, at the same time, he was much more populist than he was anything else. And so even within the parties, I mean, you've got the Democratic Party where they're suddenly having to deal with this huge influx of much further left Democratic Party supporters and that started with Bernie Sanders, maybe even before. But now they're having to deal with that. And it's pushing the party to the left. At the same time, you've got the Republican Party, which is not being pushed to the right by, maybe in some areas, but for the most part, it's being pushed it's being pushed towards Trump. And Republican Party has simply become an extension of Trump nowadays, for the most part. So you've got a lot of Republicans, I think, that aren't happy about that, that are more ideological in nature. So, next year, well, really this year with the presidential race. It's going to be. I think it's going to be all over the place. Just interesting to see.
Yeah, I talked to a friend of mine at work, and I told him I think the sequel is going to be much more. The sequel of the story is going to be so much more entertaining than the original.
Yeah, I hope it's written well this time.
But because it was the first one was interesting because Trump was going after members of his own party, and
they were going after him.
And they were going after him. But it'll be interesting to see how he will really, I think he'll unleash even more because there's nothing holding him back. They're not members of his own party. They're people he's been going after for a long time, whether it's Elizabeth Warren. And, the reality is I think a lot of the Democratic nominees are giving him content. They're just constantly giving him material.
I think you have a really good point there. Sometimes, and the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they do not call me for advice. But if they were to, if the Democrats were to, my biggest advice would be, shut up about Donald Trump and really focus in on, all right, here's what we would do. Here's what I would do as as president. These things. Now you can talk about under the Trump administration these things happen, but Trump in many ways was just a continuation of presidents before him, whether it was Obama, Bush, whoever. He continued so many of the policies. Now, sure, there was a lot of policies that were very different that a lot of the left has been upset over. But I've been surprised that, I was surprised that the left was not incredibly upset when Obama continued a lot of Bush's policies, because he came in, we're going to change everything. He changed a lot of things, but he didn't change a lot of things when it came to like foreign policy and stuff like that, or even economic policy in many ways. And Donald Trump has come in, and a lot of the things that people talked about being the swamp, he has kept.
Sure.
And so continued a lot of those policies. So I think a lot of the real debate, the real arguments that are going on between, I don't know, left and right, Democrats and Republicans, whatever, I think a lot of that is over sort of policies on the fringe, policies that aren't as much the core policies that simply sort of stay the same year after year, president after president. And a lot of that has to do with the administrative state and the bureaucracy. I mean, those people, presidents come and go. But the people in the administrative state, what we would call the deep state, I guess, the swamp, they stay. Presidents come and go. These people stay.
But the legislators are there.
And they don't go away either.
No, they're there for a long time. Do you think people dislike Trump, or do you think they dislike some of the ways that he talks? Do you think they dislike the fact that he's had Supreme Court picks, 2 of them, and who knows what's going to happen with Ruth Bader Ginsburg if President Trump's reelected? Then that's another 4 years that he could potentially fill that spot if she were to pass away. Right. So what do you think is the biggest draw for all the, I guess, hatred towards President Trump?
Oh, I think it's just because he won. I mean, I honestly think that it was so unexpected for a lot of people that he had, people in the Democratic Party, people on the left, he had no chance of winning, that he was obviously going to lose. And so when he won, I think that just exacerbated. It wasn't so much we hate Donald Trump and his policies, it's we hate the fact that we lost, that he won, that he beat. This was supposed to be a historic election in the sense of, the first woman president and all these things, were supposed to happen. And it turned out it was a historic election, but it was not at all the kind of history that they were looking for. And I think that they stayed upset about that. I think that all the stuff about the Mueller probe and all of these other things, I think that's just an extension of the fact that people lost and they couldn't believe they lost. So there's got to be a reason why they lost. And by extension from that, then that's when you start labeling, Trump's core, the people that are his core followers, and you start throwing labels at them.
Deplorables.
And when a lot of those labels, they don't fit. These are just normal Americans, just like on the other side. They were just normal Americans supporting Hillary Clinton for the most part. But again, it's that thing of the other. It's that thing of
you're not on my team.
Yeah, and so we have to nowadays. We have to destroy you.
Yeah,
and so they go after Trump because he represents all of that. Plus, he doesn't follow the rules of decorum. In any way whatsoever.
No, he doesn't. Well, one thing I think he's very good at is what magicians call sleight of hand. He's great at just kind of dangling something in front of you and waiting for you to just take the bait, and it's always taken.
Yeah,
because
he's good at baiting.
Oh, he's great at it. I mean, that's not for me to say that I'm a supporter of his or anything, but I'm just saying he's really good at it. And if you're not on his side, then you could easily agree with that one. But I think, like I said, Democrats give him material. He throws out some material, some bait, as you say, for people to take, and it's always taken.
It really is. And this goes back to something you had mentioned earlier, which is, what about what the Democrats are doing now? What should they be doing now? And again, my advice to them is stop doing what you are doing right now, because what you're doing right now is going to really turn people against you. You've had, now that the Mueller probe, and of course, what you're seeing now is Democrats saying, okay, well, they're saying that there was no collusion or conspiracy, but we want to see the full report. Well, once they see the full report, they'll say, well, the full report doesn't say there's conspiracy or any type of coming together.
Obstruction.
Yeah. But we want to see all the evidence behind all the reports so that we can look at that and we can come to our own conclusions about it. And so, well, that's millions of pages of documents that we're talking about there, which means that it can just extend on. Now, for your very core constituency, that's great. That's red meat for them, and or blue meat, I guess the case would be. And so it's just like when Obama was president, you had certain things that were really red meat for anti-Obama types, and so people would latch onto that. But that can come back to bite you. For example, Obama wins 2008. There's a huge backlash. 2010, the Republicans take over the House. I mean, you've got all this big swing back. But as a result of that, the Republicans, I think they pushed too far in coming against Obama. And so you ended up with 2012, where Obama pretty easily won re-election. But plus, you had Mitt Romney as the nominee.
Yeah.
I think that the Democrats need to look at that time period and say, hey, there's some things going on here that we got to be careful, because you had Trump win in 2016. 2018, the Democrats take over the House, and what are they doing now? It looks like they're doing the same thing the Republicans did in 2010,
right,
and are going to take things too far, which means that people are going to push back even harder against that and say, look, you're just going too far with this stuff. Even people within the Democratic Party that say, that's enough, let's move on to other things.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like a lot of people, and this isn't us railing on Democrats, but we're on this topic, right, and it certainly seems like people on the Democratic Party are doubling down on everything that helped them lose in 2016, whether that be identity politics, whether it be any sort of these crazy ideas that certain people are one way because of this, and certain people are another way because of that. And I don't know if that's ever going to lead them to some sort of victory.
Well, sure. And now they're even talking about what other ways can we get to victory?
Yes.
Because things are messing us up. The Electoral College is messing us up. Well, let's get rid of the Electoral College then. And people hear that and they're like, well, okay, I mean, it's got problems, but seriously, you want to get rid of the Electoral College? Oh, we have problems with the Supreme Court, and now Trump is going to be able to, maybe tip the balance there. We need to put term limits on the Supreme Court now, and we need to expand it. We need to pack the court. And people go, those are some radical ideas. And is it just because you lost? And that was one of the ways that you were seeing yourself losing, and so. And people aren't that dumb. They pick up on things like this, and I just think that as they're proposing these kinds of ideas, I mean, I think people will start saying, all right, you're sort of going off the deep end.
Well, let's talk about the Electoral College. That's been a big topic lately. People are saying do away with it, and then we can get to the changes that people are wanting to be made to the Supreme Court in terms of adding judges, which is something that just recently started up. But the Electoral College is what allowed Trump to become president. It's also what allowed Bush to become president in 2000. So what's your take on the Electoral College, its purpose, why do we need it, or why do we not need it?
Sure. Well, I mean, the statement, the Electoral College did allow Trump and Bush to become president, but that's because the Electoral College has allowed every president to become president,
right,
because it's the only way that we have.
Right.
The thing about it is most people, until the 2016 election, I think a large chunk of the American population didn't realize we had this Electoral College that actually did the electing of president. I think and I see it in my students. The students come in, and when we get to talking about the Electoral College, these are, freshmen, sophomores in college, and only a few of them know what the Electoral College is, certainly how it works. And so when I get into it, and I basically get them to the understanding that, no, when you vote, you're not voting for president. You're actually voting for a list of people who will then vote for president if their party's nominee gets the most votes in their state.
You're voting for the middleman.
Yeah, but what you're voting, what I try to explain to them is why the reason we have this system is because the founders set up a constitutional federal republic at the beginning. They did not set up a unitary democracy.
Right.
They weren't saying that, all right, we're going to have a centralized government and it's going to control everything from Washington D.C. And it's all going to be democratic in nature. No, what they said was, remember the circumstances. These were 13 independent countries. That's what they were. They had been colonies. They declared their independence. They came together first under the Articles of Confederation, but then to form a more perfect union, they wrote this new constitution. But still with the same idea that, look, we have a bunch of sovereign states here, but we recognize that unless we have some uniformity, especially when it comes to commerce and economics and some military aspects, that we're vulnerable to outside attack. We're vulnerable even within our own areas because of the so many different rules and regulations and so forth between of interstate commerce. So they said, let's make this uniform. Let's make this more regulated across the way, regular as they were. And so part of that was, okay, how do we pick, first of all, the people that are going to make the laws and make the decisions for us? So we're not going to have a democracy where you have this, potential for mob rule. We want representative government within the confines of the Constitution itself. So that's why they formed this Congress, so that the people could elect their representatives to vote. And if they don't like how they vote in the House of Representatives, they can next election get rid of them because they didn't like how they voted. But they can't control their votes. There's no way to do that. Their representation does not mean they do exactly what you tell you to do. And the same thing, the states themselves had to be represented. So that's why we got the Senate. The Senate was supposed to represent the interests of the states, and the state legislators chose the senators, and the House was supposed to represent the people themselves. The Electoral College was from that by extension then. It was part of this idea of a federal republic, the idea being that we're not going to have an election across all the states because we aren't forming a unitary government. It is a collection of states that are united together. So it's going to be the states that are going to be voting in this election through representatives elected by the people in this case, or by the legislature, or what it may be, and we call those electors. So that's why we have the Electoral College, is because electors are supposed to be representatives elected by the people for that one particular purpose, and that is to choose who the chief executive is going to be. And they put some rules in place to make sure that, for example, within each state, electors can vote when they vote for president and vice president. They have to be from different states. They can't be from their state. And so, one of them can be, but the other one can't. The idea there being that if we let that happen, then every state would only vote for their own people. So the idea was, if we do it this way, then there's going to be somebody that will rise to the top that everybody is looking at, like a George Washington. And so that way we can have somebody that is seen favorably across the states by these representatives chosen either by the legislators or then by the people themselves that we call electors. There's benefits to it, though, that came out from that. And the benefits were that no one large population area could control the entire country, which is what we would have if we had direct popular election. If it was done by the popular vote, as they say, then you would end up with some very high population areas of the country controlling every presidential election. Instead, with the Electoral College, you end up with the flyover country,
the battleground states.
You have all these states that actually have a voice, and that actually do have a say in the presidential election. And you'll have swing states, those battleground states, but those change. Just about every other election or so, you end up with new swing states. Whereas if we had a direct popular election, major population centers rarely change, and they're going to continue to control things election after election after election. So I think that the way it's worked out with the Electoral College has actually worked out well. It has stuck to much of its original purpose in keeping us a federal republic and not this, unitary democracy. But at the same time, it's also helped us in terms of being more representative of all the areas of the United States and not just a few small select areas. Now, there's ways that the Electoral College has gone way off the deep end as well.
Right, and I think it's interesting because, as we've been talking about, there's new discussion of dismantling the Electoral College, and one of the arguments is, well, a lot of candidates mainly focus on the battleground states, on the swing states. And I think, well, that may be the case, but if you do away with it, then candidates are only going to be focusing on Los Angeles, on New York, Houston, Chicago, just the major cities, and that's it. They won't ever go to those other states.
Right. No, I think you're right. Unless they have a really good plan. People talk about, well, if Donald Trump, if we had had a popular vote election, then Donald Trump wouldn't have won. I'm not sure that's true, because what Donald Trump did was he said, well, here's the system we do have.
Right.
I'm going to play that system. I'm going to go and I'm going to try to win over, even if it's just barely, I'm going to try to win over these states that are Clinton states, that are Democrat blue states, so that I can win the Electoral College, which is exactly how it played out. I think if we hadn't had Electoral College, I think he would have just had a different plan, and he would have gone to where he could to try to get the most votes possible overall. And and bring out people that, I mean, in California, there's a lot of Republicans that don't vote in the presidential election because they're like, what for? It's a given who's going to win this presidential election. It's going to be, I mean, for California. And so my vote doesn't really count. But if we had a popular vote, I think you would have tons more Republicans coming out in New York, in California, even in places in some of these battleground states. So I think that it's not a given that if we had a direct popular vote that Donald Trump would, or any Republican would automatically lose. And the efforts that are out there now to either get rid of the Electoral College, which would take a constitutional amendment, or to bypass the Electoral College through this national popular vote interstate compact, I think those efforts are misplaced. Number one, because I think the Electoral College is one of the last good vestiges of our being a federal republic. But number two, because let's say you pass this interstate compact, and now all these states in that compact that have a majority of electoral votes, they are bound together under this compact to have their electors vote for whoever wins the popular vote. And then Donald Trump wins the popular vote. And California is going to cast all their electoral votes for Donald Trump. New York's going to cast all their electoral votes for Donald Trump. I think at that point they'll sue themselves to try to get themselves out of that compact. So I think what they're doing right now is not because they think that this is a better way for democracy to move forward. I think it's just because they're Democrats and they want the Democrats to win, and they think that this is the way the Democrats will win. Not that Republicans don't have the exact same thing happening on their side. We don't want to get rid of the Electoral College. Why? Not because, well, it's such a great vestige of federal republicanism, but because it's going to help the Republican Party win in their eyes. And so it goes right back to that thing we were talking about. It's this hyper-partisanship that sort of controls the narrative.
And also, you brought up a great point, is if you take away the Electoral College, it changes the game.
Right,
so there's completely new rules. And if you're following the rules when there is an Electoral College or going by that system to try and win, then you're going to have to change your game plan if there is no Electoral College. So therefore, maybe, like you said, different people will vote for you, and more people from areas that wouldn't come out for you would.
And I remember right before the 2016 election, one of the big concerns that the Democratic Party had, that the Hillary Clinton camp had, was that Hillary was going to win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote.
Yeah.
And so they were real worried about that, and they wanted to make sure that Donald Trump was not going to say that this is an illegitimate election. And so they had all these arguments, and then, of course, the opposite happened, and they very quickly and conveniently forgot those arguments and said, nah, it's the popular vote that's what's really important here. And again, I think just because of the partisanship.
And I have an odd theory about a lot of this is I think a part of Trump wanted that to happen. I think a part of Trump wanted it to win the popular vote. And he ran on a whole campaign of, this is a rigged system. This is against me. I'm not an insider. They're trying to keep me out. And had that happened, there were talks at the time, right before the election, of President Trump going in and starting what was going to be called Trump TV. And he was going to have his own network, and it was going to be this.
He could have done it, too.
Oh, no, he totally could have done it. And they say that's why he hired Steve Bannon on his staff, because Steve Bannon, say what you will, is a media genius.
That's right.
And so there was talks about him doing that, and I had this theory that he wanted that to happen, to win the popular vote but lose in the Electoral College. And it just so happens that the exact opposite happened.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I think Trump was as surprised to win as anybody else. And I don't think it was a bad surprise for him, but I think he was surprised. I think that that he got into the race originally not so much to win, but to have his voice heard, but also that it would help the Trump brand.
Sure.
And you could sell more books, do more TV shows, whatever it may be. But, that's just not how it worked out. And so it just happened to work out that he became president of the United States of America. And so now, I think these things that are being thrown out there, say about the Electoral College, I think a lot of it just has to do with a misunderstanding of what the Electoral College is. What it was meant to do, but also a misunderstanding of our system of government. You have a lot of people that really say it's not, the Electoral College doesn't seem very democratic. Because it's not. We're not a democracy. The country was formed as a republic. And so, yes, we're avoiding the ideas of direct democracy. I mean, obviously, there's some democratic principles that are involved in the representative form of government. But so I don't think that's a valid argument to make. Now, the biggest problem I'm having right now with stuff with the Electoral College is not just, say, the attempt to either get rid of it or bypass it. But one of the things that's happening within a lot of the states, you've had 29, 30 states that have passed laws that bind their electors to only vote according to who won their election within their state. In other words, say, Texas has 38 electors. 38. So Donald Trump wins Texas. That means that he's supposed to get 38 electoral votes from Texas. The thing is, the Electoral College was set up not as a bucket of votes, bucket of electoral votes for each state. These are human beings. These are real people that are getting into that are chosen in the November election as electors, even though they were nominated by their party to support their candidate. These are real people, and in Texas, like in just under half of the states, there's no requirement that they have to vote according to their party and who their party nominee is. So that's not ever a problem. Even when people don't vote according to the way they're supposed to vote, it's never been a problem. It's never changed any election outcome. It's always been, we have these people that become electors because they're party people, because they have either given a lot to the party, or they've put all these years of service in, or they were former elected officials, or whatever it may be. These are party people. They're going to vote the way their party wants them to, except every once in a while where somebody comes along and says, I'm not voting that way, which is constitutionally fine to do. But now you've had over half the states that have passed these laws binding their electors, saying, no, you must vote this way when it comes time, or else you're going to be fined, or you're going to be kicked out as an elector and replaced, whatever it may be. In my opinion, that's completely unconstitutional. It's never been addressed by the Supreme Court. I think it's going to be, though, because there's some lawsuits going through from Washington and Colorado right now, especially, where they had faithless electors that are going to make their way to the Supreme Court, and hopefully, and who knows, because the Supreme Court does whatever it wants to nowadays, but hopefully the Supreme Court will stick to the Constitution and say, you can't make them vote that way any more than you can make your elected representatives vote a certain way in Congress, or your senators vote a certain way there. You can't make your elected electors vote a certain way. You can force them to sign a party pledge to become the nominee, which most parties do, but that pledge then gets superseded by the oath when they become an elector, and their pledge is now to their oath is to the Constitution, not to a party. So Texas 2 years ago tried to do that. They tried to pass a binding law because we had two faithless electors in the election, and so the governor demanded a bill be put on his desk.
Right.
So they put up 4, 5, 6 bills, and I went up and testified against all of them in Austin, because I said, this is not constitutional, and you don't want to do this. You don't want to cut off your nose to spite your face just because you don't like that somebody didn't vote the way you wanted them to vote.
Right.
And they died 2 years ago, and there's only one that's been introduced this term, and it may be dead on arrival. So
a lot of it seems very reactionary too,
Sure.
where they want immediate results for them, but also what happens in politics is you see this. I think what happened with the Supreme Court justices, when you use any sort of nuclear option.
Yeah.
That always ends up and bites you at some point down the road, but it helps you at the moment, but at some point it's going to work against you.
Yeah. One thing about politicians that 99.9% of them engage in is they look at the short term and not the long term effects, and they look at what the short term effects will be on a small group of people, and not what the long term effects are going to be on everybody. And so, but they're politicians. They're very short term oriented, and so you end up with those kind of results. It's the same thing with economics. Politicians, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into economics, but politicians love Keynesian economics because it focuses on the short term. What can we fix today to make things work today, even if it's going to really screw things up in the long term? Keynes said, well, in the long run, we're all dead. So let's just focus on the short term.
Let's focus on it right now. Yeah, and I wonder how much the election cycle, the 4-year election cycle that we have plays a part, because Like you said, politicians are focused on 4 years. How can I make it to the next election? They're not focused on
members of the House. They're focused on 2.
2 years,
they get
exactly.
elected, and they're like, all right, how do I get reelected?
Exactly. I mean, it's a 24/7 election season always. So if you ever think, oh, okay, we just had an election, we won't hear about this for a while, you're dead wrong, because you're going to be hearing about campaigns every single day of the year.
Yeah, and even for U.S. senators who have a 6-year term of office, they're so hyper-partisan now that they still focus, it's all campaign all the time, because you got to get your party to win. And so even though you don't have to worry about as much as your own reelection campaign as a senator, for 4 years, and then in the last 2 years, then you have to at least pretend that you're paying attention to your constituents. Nevertheless, they're still in campaign mode all the time because their party requires it.
Yeah,
you've got to get your party to win, and you've got to be in the majority, and so I think that well, once again, it just goes back to the issue of parties. I mean, George Washington was real clear when he gave his farewell address. He was like, look, whatever you do, don't have political parties.
He could have been president till the day he died.
Oh, if he wanted to, sure. And he knew that, too. And that's why I think he got out after 2 terms, because he said, if I do that, we'll have a king. But at the same time, when he left, he's like, don't have parties, because parties are going to ruin this stuff. Don't have political parties. And, of course, the immediate next election was our first presidential election with political parties. And we've had them ever since. In fact, we had to pass a couple of amendments because that messed up the Electoral College system. And so parties are parties because we're human beings, and we look for factions. We look for people to identify with and people to identify against. The problem is when you come in and you take it too freaking seriously in terms of your party right or wrong. And I have a real problem with that.
Well, you also have to be, and it's hard for people who've worked so hard to get to that level to say, I need to be self-aware of my power. It's very difficult because you don't get to that level, and then once you're at the top, say, I'm going to cut myself off here.
Yeah.
And I mean, Washington was great because he was able to do that. He said, I know I could do this forever. The people loved him and everything, and he could have done it until he couldn't walk anymore. And people have to realize that politicians are not going to be that self-aware of their power.
Which is why we have a constitution.
Yes.
I mean, that's what Jefferson was talking about when he said bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. He's talking about elected officials and even appointed officials like judges, where he said that it's the Constitution that puts all these restrictions on. So we have to bind people. Otherwise, it'll be like Lord Acton said, where he said that power tends to corrupt. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the more power that the government takes to itself, the more that the people that are in power say, I like this power and I want to keep my power and I want to do anything to stay in power. And let's get some more power while we're at it. If you have something that's going to restrain that, that's going to bind that down like the Constitution, then no matter how much power they want, there's only so much power they can get. The problem has been for us is that too many people have ignored the Constitution, and to where Congress says, well, we're going to use the Commerce Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause or something to take more and more power to ourselves. It gets challenged by someone, goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, nah, that's okay. And so now they've got more power, and it's just, it's that toe in the door. It's that, camel's nose under the tent. And so more and more power starts going. And then the president, the executive branch says, well, we're going to do this and this and this. Congress could stop the executive branch from taking power that they don't have. Congress doesn't stop them. Now the executive branch has history of having these powers, and it's hard to then get rid of those powers. The judicial branch takes more power to itself. There's nothing in the Constitution about only the Supreme Court can determine what's unconstitutional or not. Nothing in there about that. But the Supreme Court determined that's what the Constitution says about themselves. And so,
of course they did.
Yeah. So the federal government is like, and going to the Supreme Court, it's just kind of funny. What has happened ultimately is that the states have given up their powers. The states are the ones under this compact of states that we call the Constitution. They're the ones that are supposed to have almost all the power. And they delegated very few specific powers to the national government. But what's happened is the national government's taken more and more and more and more to itself, and the states have said, okay. And they haven't fought back against that, and especially in the last century or so. So I think that I think that's probably the biggest part of the problem is that the states, and that means you and me, that means the people in the states, have not stepped up to take their power that they actually are supposed to have. And I think that's because people don't know what the Constitution says.
Right.
And that's my job, is I'm teaching these students, here's what the Constitution says. Here's what they're doing instead. Now, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
And now it's in the students' hands. It's not my job to say, here's what you're supposed to believe, and you have to do this, and you have to do that. My job is to say, here's what's out there, and here are the options, and here's what you're challenged with. And you need to get out there and do something about this, because I'm an old fart, I'm going to die, and you got to do something about this in the meantime.
Well, you got to teach them how the system works. Do you think that the main problem is the Constitution, and that it's in parts it can be too vague, or that the way people manipulate the Constitution?
Yes.
All of it.
But then again, the Constitution is vague in many parts because it was never meant to be like the Texas Constitution. It was never meant to be this detailed delineation of here are the powers that the government has down to this minute little thing. Mm-hmm. What it was supposed to be is, look, we're going to give you a few of these broad powers. Everything else the states are keeping. You're not going to, if it doesn't say that you can do it, you can't do it. And that was what was very quickly forgotten. Very quickly it became, well, the Constitution doesn't say we can't do it.
Exactly.
So
we don't look at it the right way.
And that's not at all. And Jefferson would talk about that. He's like, if this is how you interpret the Constitution, boy, are you wrong, because the Constitution is supposed to be this very constraining, restrictive document. And so, I mean, there have been people that, Lysander Spooner or others that have said that if the Constitution was as constraining as people make it out to be, then we wouldn't have all these problems today. So obviously the Constitution is not constraining enough. And that there's a really good point to that, maybe it should have been more specific. And of course it got more specific with the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. Those 10 amendments were added to re-emphasize the fact that this federal government wasn't supposed to have all these powers, especially once you got to the 10th Amendment, which was to be that catch-all of, look, if we didn't tell you you have the power, then the states have that power. They kept that power. Who even looks at the 10th Amendment anymore? I mean, now, that's a racist amendment or something. And so now you don't want to talk about 10th Amendment. You don't want to talk about the powers of the states themselves. Now it's all centralized. The problem that comes in there, and this is what I try to emphasize to my students, if you want to give the government or some people in government a whole bunch of power to do what you think is the right thing to do and stop those other people from doing the wrong things, remember, those other people eventually are going to be the ones in power.
Yep.
And you have now given them that power to do whatever they want to do and to stop you from doing what you want to do, because you gave them that power. Don't give them that power. Stick to what the Constitution says and make it real restrictive so that they can't go beyond those boundaries. Oh, but I think government ought to do this and this and this. Well, then understand, when people get into office that you don't like,
when your team loses,
and they will,
yes,
then they're going to do the same thing back at you, and you're going to be so upset and so mad that you're probably going to demand an independent prosecutor because you think Russia had something to do with it. And that's not going to help anybody, and it's not going to solve any problems, and it's not going to move us in the right direction.
No, it's just like when you're in sports and you're talking smack to some other team, and you're in their faces, you're telling them exactly how it's going to go, and then your team goes out and you lose, and then you realize, oh, they're going to start hitting us even harder because not only did we talk smack to them, we also just lost. So they're going to double down on how they feel, and they're going to overtake us. And I think a big part of it is, you were talking about it, it's kind of like a pendulum that just swings back and forth. Mm-hmm. Maybe the country leans left on a lot of issues at one point in time, then it starts to lean center, and then it starts to lean right. What do you think decides that shift in the pendulum?
Boy, that's a great question, because it's so many things. I don't think there's one causation. There's a lot of correlation, and it can lead to causes, but I think you're going to have, over time, I think is where you see, I mean, a pendulum doesn't move fast, a large pendulum. So I think what happens is it swings, and it'll swing as far as it can with its own weight in one direction. And a pendulum that's a heavy pendulum, and I guess if we're with this metaphor, the United States is a big country, and its political system is this huge political system. And so I don't think that it can swing too far one direction or another before it, by its own weight, starts to move back again. So you do see shifts, and so you'll see in the 1960s this big shift more towards the left, and it goes through the 70s. But then it goes as far as it goes, and then you start to see a response to that from this bulk of the middle of America. That says that's maybe too much, and so they start listening to other voices, and you see the pendulum start to move back, and then you end up with then you get into the 80s and Reagan and the Republicans and the rise of the new conservatives, and then they're in power, and you get into the 90s, and with the 90s. Now it starts to is it going to start shifting back, and we start shifting back to the middle again, and then the 2000s, where it was sort of in the middle, shifting to the left. And now you'll have things happen along the way. When 9/11 happened, of course, that's disruptive. That's one of those events that's just disruptive to politics in general and everything. Everybody comes together, but eventually everybody breaks up back apart again, and policy reigns supreme again. I think what we're seeing right now is there is this pendulum where you have this huge part of America that feels it has been ignored for maybe the last decade or so. And I'm not talking about ethnicity. I'm not talking about any particular demographics. Just that you've got this big part of flyover country that says we're ignored. Nobody's listening to what we have to say about things. And then some people step up, or Donald Trump steps up and says, "I'll pay attention to you. I think the way you do. I mean, I'm a billionaire, so we got some differences here. But I'm a regular Joe like you."
That was always bizarre how he was able to do that. He's a billionaire, but he was able to relate to so many of these people in what we call flyover states,
right.
And they said, he gets me. He may live in a skyrise that has his name on it, but he gets me.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right on that. I think that's the connection that you need in politics. There was a lot of people. Most people did not say, Hillary Clinton gets me.
Right.
She understands where I'm coming from. Now, the people that agreed with her on policy issues or whatever, they were all gung-ho. I think there was a lot more people that just didn't like Donald Trump and his personality and the fact that he didn't follow the rules of politics. But there's a lot of people that voted for her that were just voting against him. But then again, there was a lot of people voting for Donald Trump that were just voting against Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And I think probably more than in most recent elections you saw that happening. So my hope continues to be that that's not how we vote for people, that we don't just vote against other people. But I don't hold out a lot of hope for that in the near future. I think in the next election, I think in the presidential election in 2020, you're going to have a whole lot of people that are voting one way or the other because they're voting against the other side.
Right.
It's just sort of where we've gotten to here. And the pendulum moving, I don't know that it moves that much, that particular way that people vote.
And that fast, yeah. Yeah. It's it'll be interesting to see what happens next year, and I will say it'll be entertaining over the course of this next year.
Yes.
Especially being in the media and you being a political science professor, so it'll be fun to watch.
I have this thing. I keep telling people that I'm going to take stock in popcorn companies. because the more that happens, the more I'm in politics and I study politics and I teach politics, the more I feel like I just need to pop popcorn and sit back and watch it. And I did that in the 2016 election to a large extent. I was like, I didn't have any particular dog in the fight, and so which was why when I got into the Electoral College myself, I was not an obedient little party person, and so it was but a lot of that just was because of exactly what we were talking about there, and I just don't. I wish that people would pay more attention to issues and to policy, and not so much personality, but and not so much party, but those are wishes.
Yeah. And there was all this talk about how 2016, it changed everything. It changed how we look at politics. It changed this. Did it really change politics, or is that overplayed?
Oh, I think it's way overplayed. I think it changed politics in the minds of a number of people. And I think that's because the outcome was just not what they expected. I think within the Republican Party, the outcome was not what a lot of Republicans expected. This Donald Trump guy came out of nowhere. He was not this long-term Republican Party guy. In fact, he had talked about running as a Democrat not long ago. And so that it was a total surprise to people, a lot of people in the Republican Party side of things. When he got the nomination, then it was just pretty well understood, I think, by Democrats, by people on the left. Well, that means that we're going to win because there's no way that this guy can win. But then he wins, and I think because it's such a total surprise, in the minds of so many people, you've got politics has completely changed. The 2016 election has changed everything. And no, I don't think it changed everything. I think that you had somebody that knew how to do things within the system that he was given. And so he knew how to do primaries and caucuses. He knew how to get enough delegates, and he had people that knew how to do that, and was able to. And he's got a pretty good gut for a lot of these things as a businessman. And I think that once he won the nomination, he had people. They knew that this is the Electoral College system. This is how you win this. If we're going to have any chance, then we're going to have to swing these particular states. Meanwhile, on the other side, it was the understanding was that no, it's business as usual in terms of those states are ours, for example. That's our states. We don't even have to go there. We're going to win those states no matter what. And I think that's why in the minds of so many people, the 2016 election changed everything, because it changed the norm that they had thought was the norm. And in reality, I think that it more embraced the norm of politics, which is a lot of change. And if you got to keep up with these changes within the system you're working in. And I think they just didn't work the system right, to be honest.
I think it might have changed also what we view as a politician, as somebody who we can accept to be president, not for good or bad, but just the type of person that we accept, the way they talk, the way they present themselves. You mentioned Mitt Romney. I think people thought Mitt Romney was kind of the ideal politician, or they thought Hillary Clinton was the ideal politician, or Barack Obama was the ideal person that you expect to see in the White House. But then somebody comes out and basically is a huge middle finger to all of that, and maybe it changed our perception on what we view politics is.
Yeah, and in fact, I honestly thought that there would be way higher turnout in the 2016 election than ended up being. I mean, it went up a little bit, but not a whole lot. And part of that was I thought it would be higher because there was a lot of exact what you were talking about there. There was a lot of here's our chance to put somebody in that's going to give the middle finger to the system, or here's our chance to make sure that somebody like that could never get into office. Instead, what you had was a lot of people that were like, it's the same old crap. It's the same old just negativity, and they're not discussing the issues. And so why would I even want to bother?
Why do I care? Yeah.
And I don't see much. I don't hold out a lot of hope for it changing for the 2020 election. I think there's going to be a continuation of attacks of personal nature. I mean, most of what people did against Donald Trump was not so much because of his policies, except for a few more controversial ones. It was much more of a personal thing, a personality thing, and things that he'd said in the past. I mean, poor Joe Biden now, he's already starting to have some real issues before he's even jumped into the race,
right?
Because he has a little problem with sniffing hair and inappropriate kissing and stuff like that. But compared to Donald Trump and some of the things that he said and did, does that mean that Biden should not run for president? I think that might have changed.
Well, here's the difference, and I think I heard this explained to me, and I heard it explained wonderfully, and I'm probably going to butcher the way this goes, but what I've heard was that people like Joe Biden, people like Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and all these people, they are wearing a white gown. Donald Trump is more of a mud monster, where if you throw mud at him, you can't really tell if he picks it up. But it's one reason why I think Oprah Winfrey will never run is because she's got this gleaming identity.
And why ruin that?
Why ruin it? Yeah. And she jumps into politics, and you throw one bit of mud at her, and you ask her about some of the controversial things about the school in Africa, and
right.
They're wondering about where all this money is actually going, and
suddenly she's facing it.
Suddenly she's got a huge mud stain on this white gown that she has.
Yeah.
And I think that was why it's different. And
that's a good explanation too, because if you compare Trump to someone like Ronald Reagan, and Reagan was the Teflon president, you could throw mud all day at Reagan and it just slid right off of him. Nothing could stick to him. So it wasn't that he was wearing white as a shining armor, but it was that he was Teflon. And Donald Trump, he's not Teflon. It's just that, well, how much mud can you throw at one person? Before,
And I think a big part of it is as simple as he does not care.
He doesn't seem to care at all.
He's the one who says, I got into a relationship with a porn star.
Yeah.
And she's the one having to brag about it.
Yeah.
So, of course, I don't care. That's what I think what he really thinks. And it's and
that translates to a lot of his followers.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, Donald Trump did such and such. So?
Yeah, exactly. And I think he represents a lot of what people want. He's really wealthy. He has golden bathrooms. Yeah. He dates models. He lives in a high rise. He represents a lot of what people, I think, expect America to be, or what he represents that opportunity for them. So I think it's different. It's hard to compare him to somebody who's also running for president because he's so different from them.
Yeah, that's going to be probably the challenge that the Democrats have, and that any Republican that wants to challenge him would have, is it's not a matter of setting yourself apart from Donald Trump. That's easy to do. It's a matter of setting yourself apart to where people say, you're better, and I'll take you instead. It's always a matter of, especially if you're running against an incumbent, it's always a matter of running against what has this person done now.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump's got a lot to run on. I mean, at least here we are so far, the economy booming along in so many different ways. The stock market, doing so well. He's done so many things in terms of foreign policy. I mean, who ever sat down with North Korea and got them to do some of the things they did? And so I think he's got a lot that sort of he could bring to the table now, that he could see as positive, as long as it stays positive.
Yes.
And that's, if by the time we get to the 2020 election, if the economy is at a downturn, I think that'll make all the difference in the world.
So we're right next to the border. We're, a 15-minute drive from it.
Right.
I think recently our station's been reporting on how we're seeing pretty much record numbers of people trying to cross the border, a record number of apprehensions. Everything's been happening over the past, I think these numbers have been started since the beginning of the year. And how much does that help his chances or hurt his chances? Because I was talking to somebody just yesterday who said, I thought it was I thought the crisis was kind of manufactured. I thought it wasn't as real as people make it out to be. But then you start seeing these numbers and you're like, wow, maybe there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, I wish that I wish people elsewhere would listen a lot more to people who live here.
Yes.
Because a lot of people talk about, well, this is happening at the border and that's happening, but if you don't live at the border, you don't know what's happening at the border. It's like you said. I mean, the border is 15 minutes from my front door, and so these are numbers that are staggering, and that.
I wish I remembered the numbers. I'll remember them eventually.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but but they are they're record-setting numbers there, and this is after you had so many leaders in Washington saying that we don't have record numbers anymore. We've gone so far down, and I don't know if maybe it was true when they said it and then it suddenly changed, but boy, that's certainly not the case at all anymore. So I think that you've got a lot of people, and this is something I've learned since I've been in the Valley now, the Rio Grande Valley, for 6 years. And one of the biggest surprises that I had when I got here was I assumed, because this is when you live elsewhere in the United States, this is what you hear, and it gives you this assumption that everybody that's in the Rio Grande Valley is very in favor of any kind of immigration. That and if people come here illegally, well, then they should be given citizenship, and they should become, everything should. And I got here, and that is not the case at all down here.
Yeah.
In fact, it's much more the case here that I think probably. Probably over half the people that I have talked to here, and that includes students, and if you look online, you look at the comments on, the local comments on like the local newspaper stories and stuff. You have if not a majority, at least a plurality of people that are saying, nope, I'm against illegal immigration, and they should be rounded up and sent back, and Trump is right, and build the wall. I see build the wall all over the place now.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one because we've actually interviewed people who live on the border.
Right.
They live, their lands is next to the Rio Grande. And they're saying, I will give up my land to have this wall built. And I find that to be interesting because if you watch a lot of news, you would think nobody wants it built. But there are people who live right there who are saying it. And that's not to say that there obviously aren't people who are anti the wall.
And there are.
And there are plenty of those. But I find that fascinating when you talk to the people whose land it actually affects what they want.
Yeah, and I think what's happened is a lot of the media have not paid as much attention to just the. I think they've ignored a lot of opinions that they're now starting to realize that there's opinions that we did not even know, and so when it comes to these issues like immigration and. Illegal immigration especially. I think there's the media is having to start picking up on this now that, well, maybe there is a crisis, number one, and maybe there's a lot of people that are upset enough that something has to be done about it. Because up to this point, not much has ever been done about it. The only time they actually did anything is they built a border fence for a while. It was bipartisan. And why was it bipartisan? Because you had so many people that were saying, look, we've obviously got a problem down there.
Yeah.
Now it's become a partisan issue.
Yes.
Now it's no longer an immigration issue. It's a partisan issue. And so, well, if Trump wants something, then obviously the other side has to be against it, even if it really is a humanitarian crisis that needs to be resolved. And what that does is it pushes Trump or his supporters or whatever even further to where now, Donald Trump's saying, look, I'm going to shut the border down because of this crisis that we're having. And of course, then you get this hyper response on the other side. And at some point, they're going to have to take a bipartisan approach where it can be resolved. I mean, the issues go way deeper than just what we're facing just right now. There are long-term issues, including things like immigration policy itself, the existence of the welfare state, whatever it may be. But in terms of immediate crisis, just ignoring it, I think it's just ignoring is going to hurt whoever is just ignoring it.
Yeah.
If that's the Democrats, then that's going to hurt them.
I feel like that would hurt everybody.
Sure.
Ignoring it, but that wouldn't help anybody anywhere.
Yeah.
And I've had a couple of people who ask me, because I'm from Houston originally, and I have friends back there, and I have friends who live in other states too. They asked me, so what do you think about the wall now that you've lived on the border for a number of months now? And I honestly say I have no clue. I really do not know how I feel about a wall. I just don't know. But I will say that when people talk about a crisis, it's not so much about a crisis about having these people come in and then you're worried about terrorists sneaking in or criminals sneaking in. I think there's also a crisis once they're here. What do you do with all these thousands and thousands of people? And in one case, just I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had 1,000 apprehensions in one day.
Yeah.
So,
and now we're catching them and releasing them.
Yeah,
we got nowhere to put them.
No way to put them, exactly. So I think that's a bigger question than people trying to sneak in. Is what happens to all these people now? Because I mean, do you just send all of them back, or do you catch them and then set them out? I have no clue.
Yeah, and it's a and it may be above my pay grade too, but I think that if you look at it in terms of economics, the basic economics is supply and demand, and if you have a very large supply of any particular item, then then the cost of that item drops dramatically until you have a large demand for that item. I think one of the things that's happening is that there is a large supply of people coming from especially Central and South America now, and there's a system in place that we do have for immigration, for legal immigration, but the supply is overwhelming the system. And so what they're doing is they're going around this. It's almost a free market approach to immigration, where it's kind of like with drugs. I mean, there's a big demand for drugs in the United States, and there's a big supply then that results coming out of other countries. And what they're doing is they're going around the system where, well, it's illegal for these drugs to come into this country, but obviously there's a reason why there's so many that are still coming into this country. And so there's obviously a reason why there's so many people coming into this country. And part of that could be the demand for there is still a huge demand for labor in this country. This is America, and the economy's doing well. And so there's so many jobs that are going unfilled now that, hey, there's this big supply that could come in. Yeah, but there's rules that they have to go through. Well, the rules are so bad and they're so slow and so cumbersome that they game the system. They figure out other ways, and now the market has really taken over, and entrepreneurs have stepped in, and we call them human smugglers, and now they're going down to Central and South America, and they're advertising everywhere, and now we're hearing they've set up bus lines where all the way up to the border they're just busing people up now because they pay them money to bus them up to the border. Well, yeah, that's a market-based approach to that. But again, we have a system that I think it's an obviously broken system, and so I think that you're going to have to do some short-term fixes in terms of how do we process people that are now the whole thing is, well, we can claim asylum, and that'll get us into, because there's too many of us, and they just release us into there. So if they're able to game the system that way, then obviously there's a problem with the system. And I think that's what it comes down to. And nobody wants to talk about the immigration system itself. Nobody wants to talk about fixing the immigration system itself. And certainly nobody wants to talk about what I always talk about, which is that the Constitution doesn't actually give powers over immigration to Congress. But that's for another day.
Well, but I think a lot of this is also helping President Trump on the approach of 2020.
Politically, it certainly is helping.
Yeah, he's really kind of been he's had a pretty solid, I would say, 2 weeks with the rise in the number of people who are crossing over the path in recent history right now, and then of course with the Mueller report saying no collusion, which is, I think, in terms of the Mueller report, that's all he really needed. He just needed the words "no collusion" to come down, and then that was it.
And he ran with it.
He ran with it, and it was the headline: "No collusion, no collusion, witch hunt," and then he was off and running.
Yeah, and which he had been repeating so much for 2 years now, that when that came out, he would say, "See, for 2 years I've been telling you that this is the case." Now there may be things in there where there really is some evidence of something that maybe, whether it's obstruction or something else, but who cares anymore? Now that is what the narrative has become, and the Democrats I have seen trying really hard to continue along with this other narrative, and they're hitting brick walls because people have now, that the narrative has changed, they've moved on, and you better come up with something else real quick.
Well, it sounds like they're essentially hurting themselves by still talking about we need more of an investigation, we need more to look into this more. It's like, well, we just had a 2-year investigation and they come out with these results. You're not going to find any, and like you said, it's 1 million pages worth of material.
And I've been around long enough. I remember back in the it was when Bill Clinton was president, and the Republicans gained control of the House, and then they impeached him, and that was because that was the thing to do. We're going to get him now,
right? And
we're going to impeach him. And it was what I remember was from the left, the pushback was, we need to not impeach him. He did something wrong with Monica Lewinsky. He should be censured, and we should move on. You know the organization MoveOn.org? That's how they began. They started a petition saying censure and move on. So they got this domain name, MoveOn.org, and that was all for the idea that, all right, put this all behind us and let's move on. And I think I think that they were very successful at that. The American people are ready to move on. You don't see that happening on the Democrat side now. And I think they need to take a lesson from their own history, where they're going to need to say now, look, we need to move on. And you're starting to hear people like Nancy Pelosi talk that way.
She has been saying, we're not going to impeach. We're not going to do this.
Unless something so big or it's bipartisan. So if the Republicans bring us, ask us to impeach, well, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So, so they're going to have to police themselves, and I think that's what's going to be hard for them. The Democrats are facing within their own party some of the factionalism that the Republicans have had to deal with for a while now. Where they've had to deal with either the Tea Party faction or the more libertarian, the Liberty Movement faction. Now you've got the Democratic Party, which is having to deal with the social democracy faction, and especially those factions that they just, anything we can do against Donald Trump, we need to do it against Donald Trump. And that's just, you're right, it'll come back to bite them.
It certainly looks like it is right now.
I could be wrong.
No.
Because in this day and age, the politics is so crazy. I could just be totally wrong.
Well, I mean, they did put a lot of chips in that basket. They said, look, there's clear. And the hard one for me to understand is Adam Schiff, who kept saying, I have evidence. I've got all this evidence. I've seen it.
Okay,
where is it?
Yeah.
Show it to us. Yes. And, of course, it's all members of Congress who are saying we want to see this full report. Well, show us what evidence you have. They're really drowning themselves, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Yeah. I think it's unfortunate for our political system because once again, it goes right back to what we were talking about. It becomes so hyper partisan that there's no way to find the middle ground anymore. There's no way to find the bipartisanship or just, okay, let's put that aside and let's focus on this issue and together. Instead, it's no, we got nothing to talk about with each other. And it's not just the Democrats. I mean, Trump's real good about blowing things up and exploding things as well in politics itself. But Trump is also real good at recovery to where he'll say, no, this will never happen and we'll never do that. And then the next day it's like, well, let's go ahead and try that. And so I don't think it's that he's a real big compromising guy. I think he's got a businessman's attitude about things. I'm going to throw stuff out there that is radical, and I'm going to say things that are way out there.
We'll see what sticks.
We'll see what sticks, and we'll come back to, all right, here's now we can negotiate this. Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest threat to him in 2020? Is it something that he's done in the past? Is it something that he's a policy that he's enacted? What would you say is his biggest problem as we go into the next election?
I don't think his biggest threat is much about himself. I mean, I think everything that could have been a threat to him about himself would have stopped him from becoming president.
Already.
I think the biggest threat to him is the economy. I think the economy, which looks like it's booming, is actually what we have is another Keynesian bubble that has been artificially inflated by the Federal Reserve. And I think that because you've got that artificially inflated bubble, eventually bubbles burst. And when that happens, that's when you get extreme, recession, even depression. But you at least get this major downturn in the economy. And how do you recover from that? I think that the incredible amount of growth that we've seen and the rise of the stock market and everything, while that looks like, that's really positive signs, when you at the same time look at the fact that we're $21 trillion in debt, that's unsustainable.
It's very odd to have both of those happening at the same time.
You can't sustain that. So that tells me that $21 trillion is maintaining this artificial bubble. And so I think Donald Trump's biggest threat, the Republicans in general, their biggest threat, because they're seen as the majority party in general, is the economy. And if the economy suddenly takes a big downturn, then the Democrats are going to, of course, the Republicans will probably turn around and say, well, the economy is doing great till the Democrats took over the House. And they're in charge of spending. And so it's their fault that we're having this big problem. So it could turn into I'm sure that the Republicans could turn that around as well. But in terms of a threat to Trump winning re-election, I think it's the economy. I think Bill Clinton and especially James Carville, his big advisor,
right.
I think he had it right with the whole "it's the economy, stupid." That's what hits Americans more than just about anything else is, am I okay economically? And if I'm not okay economically, then what are you people doing to fix this for me?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to also how Trump got elected in the first place. Is there are a lot of people in those battleground states,
Mm-hmm.
the Brexit states, as I've heard them called. But there are people in those states that didn't appreciate being called a hateful person when they're at the same time just trying to figure out how the hell they're going to put a meal on the table.
Right.
Because, if your life sucks, your life sucks.
Yeah.
And if you're poor, you're poor. And what you look like really doesn't much matter at that point.
At that point, it doesn't. And it doesn't matter whether you're a long-time Democrat in a very blue state.
Right.
If your party's nominee comes in and says, yeah, my policies are going to probably kill off a lot of the jobs in this state.
Yeah.
Well, people are going to say, well, then, I'm not in favor of that. I don't care if you're my party or not. I'm not in favor of that. So, economics has so much more to do with politics than I think most people even think about.
How much does the president have, and not just President Trump, but Obama, Bush, Clinton, and all of them, how much do they really impact the economy? We always see the economy's doing great, it's because of me. The moment it goes south, well, somebody else messed up somewhere.
Yeah.
So how much are they actually impacting it?
I don't think that much, to be honest. I think that it's not any one person that impacts it. Although it may be more than anything else, it is one organization, and that's going to be the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is in charge of all monetary policy in this country. Congress has delegated everything to do with the economy over to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, it looks like a government agency, but really it's a hybrid of being a government agency because the president appoints the board and the chair. They report to Congress and so forth, so they're created by Congress. But at the same time, they're like a private bank because they have ownership stock. They have, in fact, they're not even like their own bank. I'd say that they're more like, it's been said, they're more like a banking cartel. Now,
really?
Cartel means something different to us down here in the Valley.
Yes.
But a banking cartel is just like any other economic cartel. The idea is that they're there to make sure the banks survive. And they don't want the economy to crash because the banks won't survive well in a down economy. So they try to make sure that the things that they're doing, controlling interest rates, either keeping them low or increasing the money supply or whatever it may be, that's there to help the economy so that the banks do well. And so I think if anything affects the economy more than anything else, it's going to be something like the Federal Reserve and other central banks that work in concert, around the country. Like I said, most people don't recognize just how much economics and is intricately mixed in with politics nowadays. And the best example of that is the Federal Reserve itself. It is not some non-political, apolitical institution. It is created politically, and it is involved politically, and they're there to make sure that banks do well.
Yes.
And so I think this is one of the things that, and Trump is upset about the Federal Reserve. He's like, they're this is terrible what they're doing, but he's not upset because of what they're doing with the economy. The economy is doing all right, and it's moving along. He's upset because they're not doing more to make the economy do even better and to really heat up. Because in Trump's view, the economy being very heated up is a good thing.
Sure.
But the economy being forcibly heated up is not a good thing. Because that means that, again, you're just blowing the bubble up. You're expanding the bubble, and bubbles burst. And if you've made it a big enough bubble, then the bursting could be really
even worse.
Tragic.
It's like almost taking steroids, where it's good to have a healthy circulation in your body. It's good to go to the gym and gain muscle. But the moment you start injecting yourself with steroids and you're just pumping yourself up, then when you crash, it could be in the form of a heart attack, or it could be in the form of liver problems or whatever it is. So the economy is the same way.
Yeah, and I'm not blaming Trump specifically for what is going on economically. I guess if I'm doing anything, I'm blaming him for not reversing it. That's the power that the president does have is in, because he heads up the executive branch. He gets to appoint those people that are going on to the Federal Reserve Board, and he gets to appoint the Federal Reserve Chairman. Well, appoint people that go on there as those positions come up. Appoint people that have a different view of the economy than what they've had in the past, because that view that they've had in the past have brought us to this position where the Federal Reserve is simply now the enabler of a Congress that can't freaking control themselves and just want to spend more and more. It doesn't matter Democrat or Republican, they just want to spend more.
Yeah, it's got to be difficult when you say reverse it, because the way you made it sound like was that the bubble that we're in is also allowing the economy to grow as well.
It is, but artificially. And what it's doing is it's creating, it's giving false signals, which we call them malinvestments that result. And so people are now pouring money into areas that aren't the areas that the free market actually is saying, hey, here's where we need investment. And so this is what happened with the big housing boom, and when it collapsed. The reason that we had the big housing boom is because the Federal Reserve, in conjunction with the government itself, pushed hard to drop those interest rates on mortgages and push people to buy a house, get that mortgage. And so they pumped that bubble up, and eventually, of course, with all the bad mortgage, when you're pumping mortgages up so much that people that can't ever pay those things back are taking out mortgages legally. Eventually that's got to collapse. Well, the same thing happens in all the other sectors of the economy as well, and especially when you get to the point $22 trillion in debt. That's how do you when I'm teaching about the national debt in class, and I'm trying to get my students to wrap their heads around this number of $22 trillion, and they're like, how do we even imagine a number like that? So I'll play them videos about stacks of $100 bills and pallets full, and here's how much a billion is, and so here's how much a trillion is, and now you add that up and by the time we get to the end of the class, the students are, they're depressed. And they're like, is this what depression means? And I'm like, no, you're depressed in a different way than the economy. But I don't know, maybe they are similar, because it's so hard for us to comprehend. But that's because it's gotten so big, and like I said, it's simply unsustainable. And nobody in Washington, almost nobody, wants to even talk about that. They want to talk about the wall. They want to talk about that what has Trump tweeted about today. They want to talk about other things, but they don't want to talk about the fact that we have $22 trillion in debt, and Congress has a huge role to play in that. The Federal Reserve has a huge role to play in that. The president, any president that's elected, that one person can't do everything and can't change everything. But certainly the president, if the president got in there that said, I'm going to appoint people to this Federal Reserve Board that are going to be more, say, free market, laissez-faire activists, that believe in the government pulling back from the economy and letting the economy. One thing that'll do is, of course, it'll mean that interest rates are going to, if you actually let the market dictate interest rates are going to shoot up because they're so artificially low now, and that's what's creating this bubble. Well, then everybody's going to be like, oh my God, interest rates are shooting up and we're all going to die. And so government's got to do something. And I think that's where the problem, we demand that government do things. Something bad is happening. Why doesn't government do something?
Somebody needs to step in.
I need a Trump. I need a Biden. I need a Clinton. I need a somebody.
Well, and it's funny because a lot of times the same people who are saying we don't want government in our lives are saying, step in and help me out. I need something.
And that's what I was talking about earlier with ideology. If you're talking about liberal or left ideology, we don't want government involved in our lives. My body, my choice. Anybody should be able to get married that wants to, and we don't want government involved in our personal lives. But boy, do we want government involved in the economy and in doing economic things. And then you have the conservatives on the other side saying, no, we want a free market. We don't want government involved in big government and everything, unless it's to help our people or to help our businesses. And so we want a pro-business. Well, what does pro-business mean? Well, that the government steps in and helps out these businesses and these industries and so forth. And well, that's not free market. That's not laissez-faire. That's pseudo laissez-faire. And so, do you really want the government to step out? And then, of course, they turn around and say we do want big government in these personal issue areas. I think both sides they get real adamant about what they want government to do in one way, but then they become fairly hypocritical about not wanting government to do things in this area as well.
Yeah.
But if you give government that kind of power over here, it is going to take that power over there as well.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of times when we look at a libertarian party, it's one of the few times you can see some actual consistency because
that's true.
They don't want government, period.
Yeah.
Which is why they half piss off Republicans and half piss off
That's
Democrats
right.
is because it's like, just leave me alone is kind of their philosophy.
Yeah, I think the libertarian philosophy is, they have a conspiracy to take over the world and leave you alone, which would be all right with me. Don't get me wrong, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Libertarian Party for the 2020 election, because 2016 was, I think, one of their best chances ever to do really well, because you had two candidates that people were, for the most part, not voting for but voting against, and I think that, and they had Gary Johnson, a former very popular Republican governor in New Mexico. They had Bill Weld as the vice president. He was the very popular former Republican governor in Massachusetts. And so, big names. And so that was a big opportunity. And they did increase their numbers, don't get me wrong, but increasing them to 3-point-something% of the total vote is, you don't get electoral votes that way unless you get a faithless elector to step in. And
So in 2016, most people would say that was the most bizarre election cycle that we'd had. And like you said, it was a perfect time for a third party to step up and even overtake somebody, or if not overtake, but maybe get into double digits somehow. What would it take for a third party to step up? Because you mentioned Gary Johnson, and I think he got some good support, and then Aleppo happened.
Oh, yeah.
What is Aleppo?
Little misspeak.
But so what would it take for any third party to actually rise to some form of prominence?
Number one, a lot of money. I think that, and that's one of the problems with the Libertarian Party, is it spends all its money just on getting ballot access. And so now we're on the ballot and we don't have any money to run for
we don't have nothing left.
But if you have somebody, like when Ross Perot ran, of course he ran, he was really running as independent, but he formed his own party. He formed the Reform Party. And if he hadn't talked too much, he probably would have gotten at least a large number of electoral votes, if not one outright. But of course, when you run your mouth and then you quit and you come back in, you do all the weird things that Ross Perot did, that'll mess you up. So I think that one of the things was he was a billionaire and he was able to pour his own money into doing that. And I think that a third party or even independent effort, nowadays running for the presidency takes a lot of money. And if you are not in the Democratic or Republican Party, it's hard to get that money. And so I think you're going to need somebody that is independently wealthy and can pour a lot of money into it. Or if there's somebody that's maybe not as wealthy but is a great fundraiser, then I think that's what it's going to take. But secondarily, I think you also have to keep an eye on what the economy does. And if the economy has a major downturn, I don't know that the Democrats or the Republicans are going to be able to avoid much blame. They're going to blame each other, and they'll probably succeed at blaming each other.
Oh, for sure. That's what it's become. It's just become a big blame game. It's, we did all the good stuff, and you were terrible, and then it's them saying the same thing.
Sure.
So I think it's hard for people to really figure things out and sort things out, whatever this maze is that we've created. And in our area, the media, we've done nothing to help, because there's so many outlets now. There's so many, I don't mean this to sound silly, but there's legitimate fake news online, just fake news websites that is their purpose. So it is hard to differentiate between who's telling you honesty, who's telling you honesty with bias, who's telling you something totally wrong, and it's hard to figure out people's leanings, I think.
No, I think you're right. I think, I love where the internet has brought us to because of the availability of information now. I mean, it's just there. Information is available, and if you want it, you can have it. But at the same time, it's brought us to this point where it's complete overload, to where, all right, how do I sort out the information? And now I got to figure out which information is factual and which information maybe isn't. And this is one of the things that I have to teach my students, is that you have to look at the source of whatever information you're doing. And it's okay if the source is biased, as long as they're upfront about their bias.
Yes,
and you recognize the bias. And so, then take that with a grain of salt. But Yeah, the problem I have with a lot of the media outlets now is
tell me what you have a problem with us about.
They're still clutching to this idea that they are unbiased.
I think that's a great point.
I don't think that there's any media that's completely unbiased now. I think that they're all now. Some of them are more blatantly biased. I mean, if you're looking at Fox or MSNBC or even CNN in many ways, if you look at the major networks, there are reporters that try to be real journalists that try that definitely try to just present facts and so forth. But I started seeing. I mean, back in the '80s when I was an undergrad. And I had good friends that were in the journalism programs at the universities, and I started seeing at that point that the people that were getting into journalism were getting into it because they had a political position that they were coming from, and so they wanted to get involved in journalism so that they could report on this terrible issue and this terrible issue, and let's get things changed. And so they're all about change. And it wasn't a matter, and I would ask them, this was back when I was an undergrad, and I would ask them, well, what about just reporting, the news? And just reporting, oh, well, what good is that? If you're just reporting it, what good is that? We need to change things. Okay, that's a very human response. I certainly understand that. But that means that you've changed journalism.
Right.
And now we have complete and total fruits of that. If you look at any of the schools of journalism, as I'm sure you know, journalism schools, I don't think they pretend to be unbiased anymore. And so, so now you're at the point where the surveys and the polling and the different research that's being done shows that, you've got this 80-90% bias ideologically in one direction for so much of members of the media.
I will say this, that you're almost caught between a rock and a hard place in the media, because one of the privileges that we have in the media is that you're given access. It's one of the keys of being a journalist is you have access to people, to places that you wouldn't, if you weren't in the media, you wouldn't have access to. True, journalists interview the president, they interview celebrities, they interview other world leaders. So it's a very difficult situation to be put in when you're sitting next to them asking them questions, but the moment you insert opinion, you're criticized. I feel like it's you're in a prison and somebody gives you a key, but they say if you unlock this door, something bad will happen to you. You know what I mean? I can see that, it's because you're sitting right next to this world leader and you want to really tell them, hey, here's how I feel. But you can't.
Yeah.
And that's so difficult.
Well, no, it is difficult. And believe me, I know where you're coming from, because I feel the same way about academia. In my opinion, it's not my job to get in front of these students to say, here's what you ought to think. Here's what you ought to believe. Here's the policy positions you ought to support. Believe me, I have very definite opinions on government policy and ideology and things like that. But I don't see that as the job of a college professor to be forcing their own beliefs on the students themselves. My job is to say, look, here are all these different beliefs, here are all these different ideologies, and here's all these different policy positions, and what we need to do is, all right, what are the effects of these policies? Let's take a look at the impacts of these policies. And in fact, when they write research papers in my classes, that's what they have to look at is policy impacts. And then as a result of what are the policy impacts, now tell me what you think is this a good policy or a bad policy. But you got to base it on actual, on actual facts.
Yeah.
And so, but what I see is so many other professors, and even around me, that are, I'm going to say, just as ideologically biased as I am, but they bring it into the classroom and they make sure it's really well known what their ideological bias is, and they teach that, and they may even grade on that, some of them. And so, and I see that, and I'm like, no, this is not the way it's supposed to be. So I have this same issue, not just with journalism, which in my opinion should be not unbiased. I guess the word I'm actually looking for is balanced. Much more. Okay, here's what opinions are out there, and here's what facts are out there. And the whole thing about alternative facts, well, there really are alternative facts. If you've only presented these facts, but you haven't presented these other set of facts, that means there's alternative facts out there. Not that there's things that are lies and things that are facts.
Sure.
And this is what I see happening in academia. This is what I see happening in journalism. I guess it's happening in so many different places where there's a deliberate push to only show this set of facts. And what about all the people that believe this stuff over here as well?
This was about 2 years ago. I was speaking to this high school, and I was when I was in Victoria, and I was speaking to this high school, and one of the students asked me, it was a journalism class, they asked me, what's your view on the term fake news? And I thought, I love it and I hate it. And as someone who's in the media, I don't completely disagree with that phrase, because to me, what fake news to me means is people who only watch Fox News, or people who only watch CNN, or people who only watch MSNBC.
And that's the only place they get it.
And that's all they're ever doing.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I like to watch all the major networks.
Yeah,
I like to read the different papers and see how they're presenting the same story in different ways.
Right.
But it's very difficult to ever look at something in a different light if you're watching the same people tell you the same thing over and over and over again. It's one reason why I wanted to start this podcast and have tons of different viewpoints, and maybe I could understand where other people are coming from. So when Trump says fake news, he's not entirely right, but he's also not entirely wrong when he says it. There is a lot of media, and I'll give you an example. When I was in Victoria, we covered this huge story there. It actually made national headlines of a mosque that burnt down. And we found out that it was a gentleman had burned, not gentleman, he burned this mosque down. This man had burned this mosque down. And it just so happened to be, it was the same night. It was the night after President Trump signed the travel ban.
Ah, yes.
And so immediately that night, a mosque is burnt down, and it's national headlines.
Right.
This mosque has been burnt down. What is President Trump doing? Blah, blah, blah. About 2 weeks later, we found this out at our station, or about a week later, that this guy had stolen some computers from inside this mosque, and he was just trying to cover his tracks. He went back a second time to erase the evidence, so he decided he would burn it down. It just so happened to be it was that night and then the moment this all got out, there was no more coverage on it.
Yeah.
And so
because it didn't fit whatever narrative.
It didn't fit the narrative, and so I see that, and I think when you say fake news, it's of course it's a negative because it's a catchphrase, and then every time he says it as a journalist, you're thinking, well, I'm trying to be honest here. That's not what I don't want to lie to people.
Right.
But when I see that happen, and there's other examples too, when I see that happen where the media, in a sense, tries to control the narrative, it becomes real. It becomes actually having an effect on you, because when you say this mosque was burnt down and it stirs up an emotional response, all of a sudden there's no more coverage on it, and you're just left with the emotional response, and there's no really any more reporting that comes on that story.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, there's recent research, and I'm trying to remember who did it, but I think it was the Heterodox Academy that was reporting on it. And it was talking about just that, which is that people don't trust sources anymore.
Yeah.
Because they've seen so many things where either it was a lie, or it was simply misrepresented, or the idea was that it completely focused on this, and then when that narrative, as you said, changed, or it didn't fit the narrative anymore, complete focus on something else, and well, what happened here? What happened to this? What's going on here? And one of the results of that research is that people start saying, well, I'm not going to believe any of it then. I think that's a dangerous place to be. I think if we don't believe journalism, if we don't believe the media, if we feel like that we can't believe a lot of the time, then I think we're in a place where, well, now we're going to look for who we can believe.
Yeah.
And I think that'll put us back into bubbles again. But at the same time, it'll also put us in a dangerous position of we're willing to believe something more easily somewhere else because we're not getting just straight up or down facts. And not to say that journalism has ever been completely just straight up or down facts.
Yeah.
Because again, we have these people that we call human beings that are journalists.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to ever have a completely unbiased, but you can certainly have fairness. You can certainly have balance. You can certainly have an attempt at recognizing bias and trying to avoid the bias. And I don't think there's even that much of an attempt anymore. Part of that is the feeding frenzy.
Oh, for sure. It's we're always constantly wanting to take something in, something in from the media. And you mentioned Trump's tweets. We're always, what did he tweet? What did he tweet? And then there's, 8 talking heads on CNN about what is analyzing this tweet when he's just criticizing somebody, and that's all it is. And I think it goes back to the sleight of hand that I mentioned that he's very good at. But yeah, I think a big part of it is that people forget that something can be both biased but true. You can, if 2 sides of the media spectrum tell you a story, you can usually agree that the facts are correct, but maybe the angle that they're coming at it is different than is a mirror reflection of each other.
Yeah, and sometimes it's even an argument over the facts themselves and whether they're correct. One of the things I like to do in my classes is present. I'll make them watch documentaries, but these are documentaries where one is very one-sided, and then I'll have them watch the opposite, sort of a point counterpoint, and they'll watch the very biased other side documentary, and then we'll have this discussion about, for example, if we're talking about global warming, and so I'll play Al Gore's movie, his documentary on Inconvenient Truth, and then I'll play the British documentary, The Great Global Warming Hoax or Swindle. And so we'll play these documentaries where they're coming from completely different angles. These are scientists that are saying these things. These are published journal reports, and these are all these facts and everything, but they're coming from completely different angles. Why is that? How is this possible to happen? And when the students start to realize, gosh, you mean there can be people that are honest and sincere, but taking a completely opposite position on an important issue, like climate change. And that's because. Well, then why is it such a controversy? Because it's become a political issue. It's not a scientific issue anymore. Now it's a political issue because government has taken so much more power to itself, to the point where it is a political issue because I got pushback from I think it was a biology professor at the college.
Really?
Who said, why are you showing them the anti-man-caused global warming documentary when it's completely false? Why are you showing it to them? Because it's completely false. And I said, really? Did you see it? Did you watch it? Well, no, I don't have to. I know that all the things that they're saying are completely false. Well, that's not what we're supposed to do. We're academics. We're actually supposed to be looking at all sides and presenting these sides to these students. And what are you teaching in your class? Is what it came down to. But I think that that's just a small example, and you can expand that out.
And I think a big problem is, like you said, politics sometimes adopts scientific issues or economic issues. I guess politics is just kind of like a big monster that eventually wants to consume all these issues.
That's a good way to describe it. A leviathan.
Yes, a leviathan. But what ends up happening is, like you said, the science aspect of it gets pushed out, or the mathematic aspect of the economy gets eliminated from it totally.
Because most of us aren't scientists or economists.
Exactly. Yeah. So it becomes a boiled down version of which side are you on, and it does nothing.
Yeah.
It becomes the same argument that you have with immigration or gun rights or whatever.
Who's making the argument?
Yes.
That's the side I'm going to take. This is why when I see some of these things where they'll go on college campuses and they're doing interviews with people and they're saying, President Trump said that his policy on this issue is such and such and such and such. And what you really gave was Hillary Clinton's policy.
Yes,
but you're talking to a Clinton supporter. And so you say, well, Trump's position is this. Oh, I'm opposed to that.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I meant to say that's Hillary Clinton's. Oh, I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of that position. Yeah.
But and I don't know. I know. And that's not just
in circles.
Yeah, it's not just one way. It's a two-way street on that. So
3 or 4 ways.
It's a lot of different ways. So I don't know. How do you overcome that? How does that end? Because we have all, as I mentioned, gone to our corners. We've gone to our battle stations, and we're ready to fight no matter what. How do you stop that?
I don't think you can ultimately stop it. I think that...
and look, healthy debate is good. It's good to disagree with people. But
I don't think we can arrive at any good conclusion if we don't have healthy debate and several different positions being taken and so forth. I think the strength of this country over the centuries has been that when we get to the end of the debate and a majority gets to have its way with a particular issue or something like that, majority of representatives, is that we then move on. We say, okay, well, I lost maybe this round. I'm still passionate about this, or I still believe this way about this issue, but I lost here. I'm not going to riot in the streets. I'm not going to get the tanks. I'm not going to get the guns. We're going to come back and we're going to engage in the politics some more. And we're going to try to win the next election, or we're going to try to win the next vote, or whatever it may be. I think that's been the strength of our republic, is that we don't want to resort to any kind of violence or something. The one time that we really did, it didn't turn out well. Civil war is not a beautiful thing. So I think that it's I think that's the strength of this country. I think that we're at this point now where as a whole, people have to make that decision of okay, we didn't win this, and what can we do to come back and win and convince a majority of people to vote our way, and not just by saying that the other side is Satan, whether you're Republican or Democrat or whatever it may be. And now, am I sure that that's something that will happen? I'm not at all sure that. But I do think that that's one of the strengths of this country. And so, can it happen? I think it's more likely to happen. It's more likely we'll survive Trump, just like we survived Obama, just like we survived Bush.
Everybody,
The only thing I'm really concerned about is that debt, that national debt, and I think that can screw everything up.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it comes down to the discourse when you say both parties are essentially, they call the other person Satan. One side will say if you're a Republican, you're a Nazi. If you are a Democrat, it's because you're a communist and you want to take over the world and you want the government to take whatever it is. Whatever. So I think the problem is when you label somebody when you label somebody a Nazi, or you label somebody on the far left, or whatever it is, you actually can't have conversations with them because you've labeled them as such. If I say, Bill Greene, you're a Nazi because X, Y, and Z, why would I talk to you? I mean, it does me a Nazi. Exactly. It does you a disservice to label somebody like that, because it eliminates any sort of conversation you can have.
Unless that person is a Nazi and has said, yeah, I'm a Nazi.
Well, of course.
and then you're like, well, I don't really want to talk to you. But for the most part, we're not labeling people correctly, I think, is what it comes down to. And even when we do label people correctly, many times they object to the label. Like I said at the beginning, labels, I don't like labels, but that they are fairly necessary for human beings to simplify things. It's how we deal with the world. We label everything. So we do have to do it. The problem is that we have to label things correctly, and I think that we're not very good at that right now.
No, we're not.
Things correctly.
We're not. I mean, I'll talk to people who they own guns and they love gun rights, and they're Democrats. And I'll talk to people, I love the way the economy's doing. I'm a big free market person. They're Democrats. Yeah. Or I'll talk to people who say, I'm supportive of gay marriage. I'm pro transgender, whatever. And they're conservatives. Right. So I don't know.
An issue to look at on that is just legalization of cannabis.
Yeah.
For the longest time it was, the Democrats are a bunch of pot-smoking hippies, so of course they want to legalize it, and the Republicans are all a bunch of conservatives stick in the mud, so of course they don't want to legalize it. And now what we have is, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, and they're all saying, we should legalize this stuff. And now they may have different reasons for wanting to legalize it, but I think it's a great example of, this is something that we could start agreeing on, criminal justice reform. This is something that all sides should start agreeing on and not labeling it a partisan issue.
Yeah.
But that's hard to do.
It is. I remember I was covering a Trump rally, and this was about 3 or 4 months before the election when he was in Houston, and we met this guy there who was a gay guy, and he had this big shirt that said "Gays for Trump." He had a big poster that said the same thing. And when we were back at we interviewed him before the rally, and we were back in the media pen. I don't know if you've seen it, but they keep it's like a bullpen, all the media cameras. So we were back there, and Trump was up talking, and he looks over and he goes, "Look, it's the Gays for Trump." look, everybody wave, say, and everybody got a big applause, and they were waving back, and it was.
And you're like, wait, these are Republicans?
I was like, wait, what rally are we at right now? Because it wasn't just like they were waving. Those two parties were waving. The whole place erupted in applause, and I thought, man, this is bizarre because it, like we were talking about, it's changing the way we look at where people can lie politically if they have certain beliefs about certain issues.
Right. And I think that just that one example alone is, I think, a really good example because Trump's probably one of the most pro-LGBTQ whatever presidents that we've had in a long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of policies that he supports, even and even campaign that way. And so, well, that's not possible because he's a Republican. We know that they hate gay people, so that can't be possible at all.
Right.
Well, no, this is this is one of those things that if you just get out of that partisan bubble where it can only be this way or that way, that I think that we'd all be better off if we just go back to what George Washington. I think we'd all be better.
Let's
Thomas Jefferson
nominate them to be our presidents. Yeah, I don't know, but Washington, I guess, was the one that people should probably model themselves after.
Good precedent.
Good. He set a good precedent. It's that was the high point, I suppose.
It's been downhill since.
Ever since then, it's been downhill. All right, Mr. Greene, we've been going for a while, about 2.5 hours, but. Okay. But thank you so much.
Like it.
No, I know, it's breezed by. You're gonna have to come back on.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me on. Yeah. You're right. It's a lot of fun, and this is the kind of thing that's enjoyable.
No, I was telling you before the show started that we were. One thing I'm in television, and one thing I absolutely hate about it is we go to somebody, an expert on something, you or an immigration expert or whatever, and we say, we want to talk about immigration and we want to blah, 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 and we use 10 seconds of the sound we get from this person who...
And it's not always the best 10 seconds.
It's not, and it's of course, it's somebody who studied these topics for 50 years, and we're using 10 seconds of their knowledge on it. So, no, I do appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, this was episode 1 of the Straight Shooter Podcast. Remember, it is less formal, but more informed. Tune in next time.